Welcome to Mr. Night Thriller, where real horror meets the sound of falling rain. Tonight, you'll hear terrifying true Ouija board stories that will make you question what lies beyond. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know. And a huge thank you to each of you for being here. Your support keeps these nightmares alive. Now dim the lights, put on your headphones, and let's begin. Story number 1. The idea, like all the worst ones, had felt reasonable in the daylight. A desperate gambit born of a week of sleepless nights and frantic, fruitless searching. But now, huddled in the pitch black of my living room with only the guttering flame of a single candle throwing monstrous, leaping shadows against the walls, it felt like the most profound and idiotic mistake of my life. A violation of some fundamental law of nature that we were now irrevocably bound to pay for. The air itself had grown thick and cold, a damp, cellar chill that seeped right through my sweater and clung to my skin. And the silence was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy, listening void that seemed to swallow the very crackle of the candle wick. There were 5 of us, the core of Sarah's world, the people who were supposed to have her back, our fingertips resting with a grotesque, feigned lightness on the heart-shaped planchette. Me trying to steady my breathing, Leo, his usual sardonic smirk replaced by a pale, tense grimace, Chloe, whose quiet sobs had finally subsided into a shaky, terrified silence, Mark, his jaws set with a determined hope that was already starting to curdle into dread, and Ben, Sarah's boyfriend, his eyes hollowed out from grief, his entire body trembling with a vibration that seemed to transmit directly from his soul into the cheap particle board of the Ouija board we'd bought from a toy store, of all godforsaken places. We'd chosen my house because it was neutral, because it wasn't anywhere Sarah had lived or died, we assumed, and because the pervasive silence of my suburban neighborhood felt safer than the echoing emptiness of her apartment. But now that silence felt predatory, a held breath waiting to be exhaled in a scream. We'd started with the simple, stupid questions the internet told us to ask. Is there anyone there? Our voices thin and reedy in the oppressive dark, and for 10 agonizing minutes, nothing, just the awkward shift of denim on carpet and the sound of our own hammering hearts. A collective failure that was almost a relief, and I was about to call it off, to suggest we just open a bottle of whiskey and drown our guilt the old-fashioned way, when the candle flame suddenly dipped and sputtered, casting the room into a frantic dance of darkness for a second before steadying again, and a current, like a weak jolt of electricity, seemed to pass through the planchette and into our fingers. It was Leo who felt it first, his head snapping up, his eyes wide, and then we all felt it, a subtle, undeniable tension, as if the plastic triangle was no longer an inert object, but a living thing resting under our hands. And then it moved. It wasn't a push from any one of us. It was a slow, deliberate, grinding slide, the sound of its little felt feet whispering across the board. A sound that was both ridiculously mundane and utterly, soul-chillingly obscene. It slid in a lazy circle once, twice, and then, with a sudden, shocking speed, it shot to the top right corner of the board, to yes, and stopped with a definitive finality that made Chloe gasp and snatch her hand away like she'd been burned. "Don't break the circle," Mark hissed, his voice tight with a fear he was trying to mask with authority, and Chloe, weeping again, slowly returned her trembling fingers to the planchette, her knuckles white. Ben was the one who spoke, his voice cracked and broken, barely a whisper. "Sarah, is that you? Are you there, baby?" The planchette didn't hesitate. It dragged our collective hands back to yes. This movement even faster, more sure, and a fresh wave of that unnatural cold washed over us, raising the hairs on my arms. Leo, ever the skeptic, even now muttered, "This is bullshit, someone's pushing," but the tremor in his voice betrayed him, and as if in direct response to his doubt, the planchette violently jerked from the center of the board and began spelling, the movement so frantic we could barely keep our fingers on it, letters blurring together in a dizzying sprint. Help. It spelled help. And then me. A collective, sharp intake of breath. Chloe was openly crying now, a low, mournful sound. "Oh my God, Sarah." I breathed, my own disbelief incinerated in that single, terrifying word. Ben leaned forward, his face a mask of anguish. "Where are you? Sarah, tell us where you are. Please." The planchette went still for a moment, hovering in the center of the board as if gathering thought, and then it began moving again, not to the letters, but to the numbers. It glided to 4, then 2, then a decimal point, then 7, 8, 1, 2. It was spelling numbers. It moved with a cold digital precision, pausing for a fraction of a second between each digit. It went through a full sequence, a string of numbers that meant nothing to me in the moment, just a jumble of digits that felt alien and wrong emanating from this ancient-looking board with its sun and moon illustration. Mark, ever the practical one, the planner, had his phone out, his other hand still on the planchette, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrific comprehension. "It's its coordinates," he stammered, his voice full of awe and terror. "Latitude and longitude. Holy shit. It's giving us GPS coordinates." He read them back, his voice shaking, and the planchette, as if to confirm, slid back to yes, with a force that felt aggressive. My mind was reeling. This wasn't happening. This was a party game, a piece of cardboard. It couldn't be giving us a location to a... I couldn't even form the thought. Ben was sobbing, his head bowed, his tears spotting the board. She's not alive, is she?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. It was a surrender to a truth we were all desperately trying to outrun. The planchette moved, slow and heavy this time, as if weighted down by an immense sorrow. It went to N, then O. No. The finality of it was a physical blow. Chloe let out a wail that was quickly stifled by her own hand. Leo was pale, his skepticism utterly vaporized, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He looked like he was going to be sick. Who did it? The question was out of my mouth before I could stop it. A stupid, dangerous question asked in 100 horror movies. A question you never, ever ask. The air in the room seemed to solidify, the cold intensifying until I could see my own breath pluming in the candlelight. The planchette remained dead still for a long, agonizing moment, and then it began to move, but this movement was different. It was no longer gliding, it was shuddering, vibrating under our fingers as if charged with a terrible, violent energy. It started to spell, but it was faster now, frantic, slamming into each letter with a force that made the entire board jump and skitter on the floor. It stopped. The candle flame guttered violently, nearly snuffing out, and for a heartbeat we were plunged into near-total darkness before it flared back up, burning an unnatural, sickly green for a second. My eyes were glued to the board. He. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I looked up, my gaze flicking between the faces of my friends, their features distorted by the stark, dancing shadows. Leo, Mark, Ben. One of them? The planchette began to move again, still shaking, and it went to the H again, then the E, as if stuck, and then it shot down to the bottom of the board to goodbye, and then back to the center, moving in frantic, erratic circles. It was like watching a system crash, a mind break. A low sound began to fill the room, a sound that had no source, a dry, rustling whisper that seemed to come from every corner at once, like dead leaves skittering across pavement, and beneath it something else, a wet, gurgling rasp that made my blood run cold. The whisper resolved itself, just on the edge of hearing, a chorus of faint, overlapping voices that seemed to say, "He's here, he's here, he's here," Ben whimpered. "Sarah, is that you?" And then the planchette stopped its mad circling and spelled, with a terrible, cold clarity, "You know him." The rustling whisper grew louder, more insistent. I felt a pressure in my ears, a popping sensation, and a faint, coppery taste of blood filled my mouth. I saw Leo wipe his nose, and his hand came away smeared with red. Mark was breathing in short, sharp gasps, his eyes wide with terror. And then I looked at Ben. He was staring at his own hands, which were still on the planchette. Dark, thick blood was welling up from the center of his palms, dripping slowly onto the board, beating on the printed letters. He turned his hands over, his face a mask of confusion and horror. There were no cuts, no wounds. The blood was just seeping out of his skin. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice cracking. The whispering in the room seemed to coalesce, to focus, becoming a single, clear, agonized voice that I recognized. A voice that had laughed with me, cried with me. A voice that was now emanating from the very air around us. A spectral echo that bypassed the ears and spoke directly into the core of my brain. It was Sarah's voice, but broken, filled with a pain that was unimaginable. "It hurts," the voice whispered, and the candle flame dipped again. My hands, they hurt so much. My eyes were locked on Ben's bleeding palms, and a memory, sharp and terrible, lanced into my mind. Sarah talking about her passion for woodworking, how she just bought a new set of chisels, how sharp they were. Ben had joked that she should be careful not to slip. A cold certainty began to dawn in me, a nightmare logic clicking into place. The planchette jerked under our fingers, pulling our attention back. It was moving with a new purpose, no longer frantic but deliberate, deadly calm. It went to L, then E, then O, Leo's name. Leo's eyes widened in terror and denial. No, it wasn't me. I loved her. He screamed at the empty air, at the board, at us. The planchette paused, as if considering, and then it slowly, deliberately, slid away from the letters of his name and moved across the board, its path unwavering, until it came to rest directly under Ben's blood-dripping fingers. It stopped. The whispering stopped. The room was plunged into a silence more deafening than any sound. Ben was shaking his head, back and forth, his tears mixing with the blood on his hands. No, he chanted, a mantra of denial. The planchette began to move again, but Ben's fingers weren't moving with it. They were locked in place, white-knuckled, as the plastic heart dragged his rigid hands across the board. It spelled letter by agonizing letter, each one a death knell, not him. It was talking to Leo. It was answering his plea. And then it moved again, turning, pointing like an accusing finger, dragging Ben's resisting hands with it, stopping first at M, then at A, then at R, then at K. Mark's face was a sheet of pure white. "Me?" he cried out, his voice strangled. "I was in Denver. You know I was. There's receipts, flight records." The planchette held its position for a long, terrible second, and then, with what felt like a sigh in the very fabric of the air, it slid away from Mark's name. The focus of the room, the oppressive, malignant attention, shifted. It left Mark and Leo. It left me. There was only one person left. All of us, our heads turned in perfect, horrifying unison. We looked at Ben. His face had changed. The grief, the anguish, the hollowed-out despair, it was all still there, but it was now layered over with something else, something cold and calculating and panicked that peered out from behind his eyes. His trembling had stopped. He was perfectly still, staring at the board, at his own blood, which was now flowing freely, dripping in a steady patter onto the floor, each drop a dark, accusing star in the candlelight. The Sarah voice whispered again, this time with a venom that made my soul shrivel. "You said you loved me. You said you'd never hurt me." Ben's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The planchette, seemingly of its own volition, its connection to us completely severed, began to move on its own. Our fingers were still on it, but we were no longer guiding it. We were just passengers, anchors for this thing that was now in full, terrifying control. It spelled out slowly, so we could not possibly mistake it. "You did this." Ben screamed then, a raw, animal sound of pure terror, and tried to rip his hands away, but they were glued fast, as if fused to the plastic. The candle flame roared up, shooting a foot into the air, burning that same sickly, phosphorescent green, and in its hellish light I saw it. For a fraction of a second, superimposed over Ben's contorted features, was another face, a shifting, smoky mask of rage and agony and unbearable betrayal, Sarah's face. And then it was gone. The planchette started moving faster and faster, spelling the same thing over and over again, a frantic, obsessive loop, murderer, murderer, murderer. The whispering became a roaring in my ears, a cyclone of anguish and fury. The windows in my living room began to rattle in their frames, a violent, shaking vibration. Pictures fell from the walls. The planchette was slamming into the board now, cracking the cardboard, the sound like gunshots in the small room. And then it stopped dead. The silence that followed was more violent than the noise. It was the silence of a grave. The candle flame shrank back to a tiny, steady blue pinprick. The planchette, cracked and smeared with Ben's blood, slowly, agonizingly, dragged all of our limp, numb hands with it. It moved to the center of the board, and with a final, dreadful certainty, it spelled out 4 words that sucked all the air from the room, that sealed our fate, that confirmed the nightmare was not only real but was standing right beside us, his hands bleeding from wounds that weren't his own. He's in the room. We all looked up. We looked at Ben, and Ben looked back at us, and the last vestige of the man we knew vanished from his eyes, replaced by something utterly empty and cold. And he smiled, a thin, terrible smile that didn't belong to him at all. And the voice that came out of his mouth was not his voice, but a dry, rasping parody that echoed from a shallow grave somewhere in the cold earth, a voice that said, "You shouldn't have gone looking." The candle went out, and in the absolute, suffocating blackness, someone began to scream. The scream was my own, a raw, torn from the throat sound that was immediately swallowed by the oppressive blackness. A darkness that wasn't just an absence of light, but a solid, smothering thing, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and coppery like old blood. And in that void, the only anchor was the feel of the cracked Ouija board under my knees and the cold, sticky wetness of Ben's blood that had spattered onto my skin. Chaos erupted in the pitch black, a terrifying symphony of crashing furniture, panicked shouts, and guttural, choking sounds that I couldn't place. And over it all, that other voice, that thing using Ben's vocal cords, laughing a low, wet, rattling laugh that was utterly devoid of anything human. "You wanted to talk to her," it gurgled, the sound moving, shifting in the dark. "So let's all have a conversation." I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my heart trying to batter its way out of my ribs, my breath coming in short, useless gasps, my shoulders slamming into the leg of my coffee table, a pain I barely registered. I could hear Chloe sobbing hysterically, a high-pitched, desperate keening, and Leo shouting, "The light! Someone get the goddamn light!" Followed by a grunt, and the sound of a body hitting the wall with a sickening thud. Mark was yelling, "Ben! Stop it! Jesus Christ, man, stop!" But his voice was tight with a terror that mirrored my own, the plea useless against whatever was wearing Ben's skin. My fingers, numb and fumbling, scrambled across the carpet, searching for my phone, which I'd discarded earlier, praying it wasn't under the couch or shattered in the melee, and my hand closed over cold, smooth glass, the candle holder, the candle long extinguished, and I flung it away, the sound of it shattering against the fireplace like a gunshot. The laughter stopped. The room fell into a sudden, breathless silence, broken only by Chloe's ragged weeping and the frantic rustle of our movements. In that silence, a new sound emerged, a soft, shuffling drag, like something heavy being pulled across the Berber carpet, and it was close, too close, and I froze, my entire body tensed, every nerve screaming. Then a whisper, right next to my ear, so close I could feel a faint, foul breath stir my hair. A whisper in that terrible, dual-tone voice, part Ben's breaking baritone, part Sarah's agonized rasp. "You're the host. You should have better control of your guests." I screamed again, a short, sharp burst of pure instinct, and launched myself sideways, colliding with a bookshelf, sending a cascade of novels and knickknacks crashing to the floor. Across the room, a screen suddenly glowed to life, casting a dim, bluish pallor over the nightmare. Mark had found his phone. The light was feeble, barely piercing the thick gloom, but it was enough to illuminate the scene in stark, horrifying fragments. Leo was on the floor by the entrance to the hallway, clutching his stomach, his face a mask of pain. Chloe was huddled in a ball behind an armchair, her hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking. Mark stood near the shattered remains of the coffee table, phone held out like a weapon, his face ashen. And Ben was crouched in the center of the room, on his hands and knees like an animal, his head cocked at an unnatural angle. The blood from his palms had soaked into the cuffs of his shirt, creating dark, spreading stains. His eyes reflected the phone's light like a cat's, gleaming with a vacant, predatory malevolence. The Ouija board lay between us, the planchette resting squarely on goodbye. He was smiling, that same rictus grin that showed too many teeth. "Let's play another game," the thing inside him said, its voice a dry rustle. "Hide and seek." Before any of us could move, could react, could even process the words, Ben moved. It wasn't a human movement. It was a burst of impossible, jerky speed, a marionette with its strings yanked. He didn't run towards any of us. He scrambled sideways, up the wall, his body moving with a spider-like agility that made my mind recoil. And he vanished into the dark mouth of the hallway that led to my bedroom and the bathroom. The sound of his footsteps, a light, skittering tap that was completely wrong, echoed for a second and then was gone. For a heartbeat, there was silence again, and then Mark was moving, his practical nature clawing its way back through the terror. "The front door," he hissed, lunging for it, his fingers fumbling for the deadbolt. Leo staggered to his feet, joining him, both of them working the locks. I crawled over to Chloe, pulling her from behind the chair. She was limp, shock setting in, her skin icy to the touch. "Come on, Chloe, we have to go, we have to get out," I whispered, my voice trembling uncontrollably. The deadbolt clicked. Mark pulled the door open, and nothing. Not the familiar sight of my quiet cul-de-sac, the warm glow of streetlights, the neat rows of parked cars. Instead, a solid, impenetrable wall of fog pressed against the doorway, a swirling, oily mist that seemed to absorb the light from Mark's phone, reflecting nothing back but a dull, gray emptiness. It was so thick it looked almost solid, and it carried with it a smell that made my stomach lurch. The smell of freshly turned soil, of rot, of that same coppery blood, and underneath it all, the faint, sweet scent of Sarah's perfume, Chanel Mademoiselle, a ghostly ribbon woven through the stench. "What the hell?" Leo breathed, reaching a hand out tentatively into the fog. He jerked it back immediately with a sharp cry, shaking his fingers as if they'd been burned. "It's cold," he stammered, like dry ice. "It hurts." From deep within the house, from the hallway, the laughter started again, echoing off the walls, seeming to come from everywhere at once. A door creaked open slowly, my bedroom door. Then a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump began, the sound of someone or something gently bouncing a ball. The sound was mundane, childish, and it was utterly soul-destroyingly terrifying. "The back door," Mark said, his voice tight with a desperation he was barely containing. "The kitchen." We moved as a single, terrified unit, a four-legged creature of pure fear, shuffling through the wreckage of my living room. I supported Chloe, who was barely walking, her feet dragging. Mark led with his phone, its light a pathetic beacon in the overwhelming dark. Leo brought up the rear, his head on a swivel, watching the black emptiness of the hallway behind us. The kitchen felt miles away. Every shadow seemed to writhe and twist. The thump, thump, thump from the back of the house continued, a taunting rhythm. As we passed the entrance to the dining room, a cold draft washed over us, and the whispering started again, not the chaotic rustle from before, but a single, clear voice, Sarah's voice, filled with a desperate urgency. "He's lying. Don't listen. The hands, look at the hands." The voice faded into a sob as we pushed into the kitchen. The back door was there, a simple pane of glass looking out onto my small, fenced yard. Or it should have been. Now it was just another sheet of that same swirling, hungry fog, pressing against the glass, obscuring everything. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it at the window. The impact should have shattered the glass into 1,000 pieces. Instead, it made a dull, muffled thud, as if he'd struck a sack of wet sand. The fog outside didn't even ripple. He hit it again, harder, grunting with the effort. Same result. The window was unchanged. It was no longer an exit. It was a barrier. From the living room, the bouncing ball stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Then a new sound. A drip. Slow. Deliberate. Drip, drip, drip. It was coming from the sink. I looked over. The faucet was off, but from its spout, a thick, dark liquid was welling up and falling in steady drops into the stainless steel basin. It wasn't water. It was blood. It began to flow faster, a viscous stream that quickly began to fill the sink, the metallic smell flooding the small kitchen. Chloe moaned, her eyes rolling back in her head, and she sagged against me. Leo was hyperventilating, leaning against the refrigerator, his hands gripping his hair. "This isn't happening, this isn't happening," he chanted. Mark just stared at the overflowing sink, the blood now spilling over the edge and onto the tile floor, a spreading dark pool. The laughter echoed from the hallway again, closer this time. The thing was coming back. "The phone!" I gasped, the thought finally piercing my panic. "Call the police! Call anyone!" Mark fumbled with his phone, his blood-smeared fingers slipping on the screen. He cursed, wiped his hand on his jeans, and tried again. He held it up, his face collapsing. No service. No bars. Nothing. He dialed 911 anyway, putting it on speaker. Instead of a ringtone, a low, droning hum emanated from the speaker, a sound that slowly resolved into a multitude of whispered, overlapping voices, all saying the same thing, over and over. Too late, he's here, he's here." Mark dropped the phone as if it had burned him. It clattered to the bloody floor, the whispers continuing to spill from it, fainter now. We were trapped, completely and utterly trapped in my own house, which was no longer my house, but a haunted, bleeding prison. The door to the kitchen, the one that led back to the living room, began to swing slowly shut with a long, drawn-out creak. We all watched it, paralyzed, as it closed with a soft, definitive click. The lock engaged by itself. We were sealed in, and then the lights in the kitchen flickered once, twice, and buzzed to life. The sudden, blinding fluorescence was almost as shocking as the darkness had been. We all flinched, shielding our eyes. The overhead light was harsh, unforgiving, illuminating the bloody sink, the pool on the floor, our own terrified, pale faces. The fog was still pressed against the window, a churning gray wall. And sitting at the kitchen table, which had been empty a moment before, was Ben. He was just sitting there in his usual chair, his hands resting palms up on the table. The bleeding had stopped. He looked normal, tired, sad, but normal. The malevolent light was gone from his eyes. He looked at us, his expression one of profound confusion and fear. "Guys," he said, and his voice was his own, weak and shaky. "Well, what's happening?" I blacked out. I had a nightmare. He looked down at his blood-crusted hands, his eyes widening in genuine horror. "What is this? What did I do?" For a second, a treacherous, desperate second, hope flared in my chest. It was Ben. Our Ben. He was back. The thing was gone. Leo took a hesitant step forward. "Ben, is that you?" Ben looked up, tears welling in his eyes. "Leo? Man, I'm so scared. I don't know what's going on." I remember the board, and then nothing. Just pain. He held up his hands. "What happened to me?" He sounded so lost, so broken. My grip on Chloe loosened slightly. Mark's shoulders slumped in relief. The nightmare was receding. We had our friend back. We could figure this out together. And then Ben's eyes, full of tears, locked with mine. And in their depths, for just a flicker, I saw it. A cold, sharp glint of amusement. A lie. It was a performance. A perfect, cruel mimicry. Before I could shout a warning, before I could even open my mouth, his expression shifted back to one of pitiable fear. "My head," he moaned, lowering his face into his hands. "It hurts so much." Story number 2. The night my grandfather was laid to rest, the air in the funeral home clung thick with the cloying scent of lilies and something darker, something stale and secretive, like the breath of the house itself had turned rotten with the weight of his passing. The wake had been a suffocating affair, relatives murmuring in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the casket as if expecting him to sit up and chastise them for their pity. And I'd found myself staring at his hands, those gnarled, work-worn fingers crossed over his chest, half convinced they'd twitch if I looked away. It was only when the last of the mourners had trickled out, leaving me alone in the hollow silence of the viewing room, that I noticed the Ouija board, the old family heirloom, its wood dark with age, the letters etched into its surface worn smooth from decades of use, was gone from where it had been placed beside him in the casket, a macabre tribute to the nights we'd spent hunched over it as kids, giggling nervously as the planchette jerked beneath our fingers. At first, I thought one of my cousins had taken it, a morbid keepsake, but the dread pooling in my gut told me otherwise, and by the time I stumbled back to my empty house, my skin prickling with every rustle of the wind through the trees, I found it waiting for me on the doorstep, the board propped against the doorframe like a taunt, the planchette balanced precariously on top, glinting under the porch light as if slick with something wet. I shouldn't have touched it. God, I wish I hadn't. But the weight of it in my hands was unnatural, too heavy for its size, the wood cold as a corpse's flesh, and before I knew what I was doing, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the board laid out before me, my fingers trembling as they rested on the planchette. The air grew thick, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening, stretching toward me like grasping hands, and then movement. The planchette lurched violently, skittering across the board so fast I could barely keep up, spelling out letters with a speed that felt inhuman, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I watched it race from one symbol to the next. Don't bury me alive. The words seared into my brain, my heart hammering against my ribs, and then the phone rang, the shrill sound slicing through the silence like a scream. It was the funeral home, the director's voice unsteady, almost unrecognizable, as he told me there'd been a disturbance, that when they'd gone to check on my grandfather's body before burial, they'd found the coffin lid marred with deep, frantic scratches, the satin lining torn to shreds, as if someone had clawed at it from the inside. The world tilted, my vision swimming with black spots, because I knew those scratches hadn't been there when they'd closed the casket, and the Ouija board's message wasn't a warning, it was a plea. I barely remember driving back to the funeral home, the road a blur, the trees leaning in as if to whisper secrets. But I'll never forget the sight of that coffin, the lid pried open to reveal the horror within. My grandfather's fingers, the nails split and bloody, the once pristine suit now wrinkled and damp with sweat, his face frozen in a rictus of terror, his mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. And then I saw it, the truth, the awful, unthinkable truth. Tucked beneath his stiffened hand, a yellowed photograph of him as a young man, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize, her face scratched out with such violence the paper had torn, and beneath it, scrawled in his shaky handwriting, the words, "Forgive me." The Ouija board had been hers. A gift, a curse, and now it was mine. The air in the room grew heavier, the shadows pressing in, and as I reached out to touch the photograph, the lights flickered the planchette, still in my pocket, burning cold against my thigh, and I realized, with a terror so deep it turned my bones to ice, that the scratches on the coffin lid hadn't stopped at the wood. They'd continued, invisible, into the air itself, as if something had been trying to claw its way out, or in. And now, as I sit here in the dark, the board on the table before me, the planchette trembling without my touch, I can hear it, the faint, desperate sound of fingernails scraping against wood, coming from inside the walls, inside the floor, inside the very foundation of this house. And I know, with a certainty that chokes me, that whatever my grandfather buried all those years ago, whatever he locked away with that woman's name scratched out and forgotten, it's free now, and it's not just his. Fingers that clawed at the coffin lid in the dark. The planchette jerks under my palm, moving on its own, spelling out her name over and over, the letters bleeding into the wood like they've been carved with something sharp, and the temperature in the room plummets, my breath fogging in the air as the scratching grows louder, more frantic, closer, until I can feel it vibrating through the floorboards, up through the legs of my chair, into my bones. The lights flicker again, then die, plunging me into blackness, and in that suffocating dark, I hear it, a wet, ragged gasp right beside my ear, the stench of turned earth and rotting lilies filling my nose. And then a voice, not my grandfather's, not human at all, whispers, "You shouldn't have buried me alive." And the last thing I feel before the darkness swallows me whole is the cold, skeletal grip of fingers, too many fingers, closing around my wrist, dragging me down, down, down into the place where the dead don't stay dead, where the Ouija board's messages are never just words, where the scratches on the coffin lid were only the beginning. And now, as the planchette spells out my name in the dark, I realize too late, that some family heirlooms should have stayed buried. The darkness swallows me whole, a suffocating void where sound ceases to exist except for the ragged, wet gasps that aren't mine. The air thick with the metallic tang of blood and something older, something decayed, like the earth itself has opened up beneath me and dragged me into its rotting embrace. My fingers scrabble against the table, searching for the Ouija board, but it's gone. No, not gone, because I can still feel its presence, the wood now pulsing like a living thing beneath my palms, the planchette skittering wildly across its surface without my touch, spelling out words I can't see but know are there, the letters searing into my skin like brands. The scratching has stopped, replaced by something worse, a slow, deliberate creaking, the sound of weight settling onto old wood, and then a whisper, so close it licks against my ear like a corpse's tongue. You open the door. My grandfather's voice, but wrong, broken, the words slurred as if his jaw is unhinged, and then the stench of formaldehyde and wet soil floods my senses as cold. Stiff fingers brush against my throat. I try to scream, but the sound dies in my chest, crushed beneath the weight of the truth pressing down on me. The photograph, the woman's face scratched out, the words, "Forgive me." Because I remember now the stories whispered at family gatherings when the adults thought we weren't listening, about the first wife, the one who disappeared, the one whose name was never spoken. The Ouija board was hers. She never left. And now she's here, her breath a rotting sigh against my cheek, her fingers twisting in my hair as the planchette moves again, faster now, spelling out the same phrase over and over, the wood splintering beneath its force. You buried me too. The floor beneath me groans, the wood cracking open like a coffin lid, and as I fall into the yawning blackness, the last thing I see is the board, glowing faintly in the dark, the planchette pointing to a single word. Welcome, before the earth closes over me, and I finally understand why my grandfather's coffin was lined with scratches. He wasn't trying to get out, he was trying to get away from her. And now, as the dirt fills my mouth and the cold seeps into my bones, I realize, too late, that some doors should never be opened, some boards should never be played, and some family secrets should have stayed dead. The dirt is heavy, so heavy, pressing down on my chest like a tombstone, filling my nose and throat with the taste of damp soil and something else, something sickly sweet like rotting flowers left too long on a grave. And I can't move, can't scream, can't even blink as the darkness pulses around me, alive and hungry. The air, what little there is, reeks of old blood and wet earth, and I can feel them now, fingers like gnarled roots twisting around my ankles, dragging me deeper, deeper, the weight of the Ouija board still burning against my skin even though I can't see it, the planchette's movements etched into my flesh like scars. Above me, through the suffocating layers of dirt, I hear it, the slow, deliberate scrape of wood against wood, the sound of a coffin lid being pried open, and then her voice, not a whisper anymore but a guttural growl, vibrating through the earth like a landslide. You should have listened. The ground shifts, convulses, as if the earth itself is recoiling from her, and suddenly I'm moving, not down but up, my body breaking through the soil like a corpse clawing its way to the surface, my lungs burning, my fingers raw and bleeding as I drag myself free, only to realize I'm not in the ground at all. I'm in the house, the same kitchen, the Ouija board still on the table, the planchette now motionless, pointing at the word goodbye like a cruel joke. But the room is wrong, the walls streaked with blackened veins, the air thick with the stench of decay. And when I look down at my hands, they're caked with dirt, my nails torn and bloody, as if I've been digging for hours. The photograph, the one from the coffin, is on the table now, the woman's face no longer scratched out but visible, her eyes hollow pits, her mouth stretched in a scream frozen in time, and written beneath it, in fresh, glistening ink, are the words, "You're next." The planchette twitches, then moves on its own, slow at first, then faster, racing across the board to spell out a name. My name, before the wood splits open with a sound like a dying man's last breath, and from the crack oozes something thick and dark, something that moves like liquid but screams like a living thing. The walls bleed, the ceiling drips, and the last thing I see before the darkness takes me again is her, standing in the corner, her fingers curled around my grandfather's shoulder, his face twisted in agony, his mouth open in a silent plea, as she leans forward and whispers, "Welcome to the family." And then the board shatters, the pieces embedding themselves in my skin, and I finally understand. It was never just a game. It was a contract, and now it's my turn to hold up my end. The pieces of the shattered board burrow deeper into my flesh, not like splinters but like living things, slithering, squirming under my skin as her laughter echoes through the room, a sound like cracking ice and breaking bones. And suddenly the walls aren't walls anymore but the inside of a coffin, the air thick with the stench of embalming fluid and something older, something that reeks of open graves and secrets left to fester. My grandfather's corpse stands beside her, his milky eyes rolling toward me, his jaw unhinging with a wet snap as he rasps, "You shouldn't have woken her." And I realize with dawning horror that the dirt caked under my nails isn't from digging, it's from being buried. The photograph on the table curls in on itself, the woman's face melting like wax, her hollow eyes pooling into black tears that drip onto the wood and sizzle. Burning symbols I don't recognize but somehow understand. Names, dates, a family tree written in blood and bile, stretching back generations, each name crossed out except mine, the ink still fresh, still wet. The planchette, now just a jagged shard of wood, drags itself across the table toward my hand, carving into the surface as it moves, spelling out the truth I've been too terrified to face. This board was never just a game. It was a prison. And she, the first wife, the forgotten one, the one they buried alive to hide their shame, has been waiting, patient as the grave, for someone foolish enough to ask the right questions. My fingers move without my permission, gripping the planchette shard like a blade, and I feel her cold breath on the back of my neck as she guides my hand toward the board, toward the last empty space, where my name waits to be carved into the wood to join the others. The moment the tip of the shard touches the surface, the house groans like a dying thing, the walls buckling inward, the air screaming with the voices of everyone who came before me, everyone who tried to resist, their warnings lost in the static of the grave. And as the first drop of my blood soaks into the board, binding me to it, to her, I finally understand the real message my grandfather scratched into his coffin. Not "forgive me," but "run." But it's too late. The board is whole again, pristine, the planchette resting gently on its surface, waiting. And somewhere deep beneath the house, beneath the foundation, something stirs. Something hungry. And it knows my name. The moment my blood seeps into the grain of the board, the air is ripped from my lungs as if the house itself has taken a final, rattling breath. The walls peel back like rotting skin, revealing pulsating veins of blackened wood. The ceiling drips thick clots of something warm and metallic, and the floorboards beneath me split open with a sound like 100 coffins being unsealed at once. The planchette levitates, spinning wildly before slamming down onto the board with enough force to crack the wood, spelling out words that burn themselves into my retinas. "Your turn, T.O. hide." The photograph erupts into flames, the woman's face twisting in ecstasy as the fire consumes her, and from the ashes rises a skeletal hand, its fingers stitched together with strands of hair, my hair, wrapping around my wrist like a vice. My grandfather's corpse lurches forward, his mouth unhinging impossibly wide as a swarm of blackened moths pour out, their wings whispering the same phrase over and over in a language that predates graves, predates death itself. "She's coming, she's coming, she's coming." The temperature plummets so fast my skin cracks, blood welling in jagged lines that mirror the board's fractures. And then I hear it, the slow, wet drag of something moving through the walls, something too large, too wrong, its breath rattling like a corpse choking on dirt. The planchette explodes into splinters, each shard embedding itself into my palms, sewing my hands to the board as the first wife's voice slithers into my ear, her words vibrating through my teeth. "You open the door. Now you hold it open." The walls dissolve into a writhing mass of grasping limbs. The floor opens like a hungry mouth, and as I'm dragged under, the last thing I see is the board, now fused to my skin, its letters rearranging themselves into a single glowing command. "Play again?" And somewhere in the dark beneath the world, something laughs, a sound like a burial shroud tearing. And I realize too late, that the game was never about asking questions. It was about providing answers. And now, as the dirt fills my mouth and the cold stitches my eyelids shut, I finally understand why my grandfather's corpse smiled in his casket. He wasn't at peace. He was waiting for company. The dirt in my mouth turns to ash as I scream, but no sound escapes. Only moths, their wings coated in something thick and coppery, bursting from my throat in a grotesque parody of speech, their tiny legs scraping against my teeth as they crawl out into the suffocating dark. The board is part of me now, its wood fused to my ribs, the letters pulsing like a second heartbeat beneath my skin, each throb spelling out a name I don't recognize but know I should. Hers, the first wife, the one they sealed away but never truly silenced. The limbs dragging me deeper aren't roots or bones, but strips of the coffin lining, satin turned to sinew, stitching itself around my limbs like a living shroud. And the cold isn't just absence of heat, but something hungrier, something that gnaws at the edges of my soul with teeth made from the planchette's shattered remains. Above me, through layers of earth that shouldn't exist, I hear the faintest sound, a child's laughter, my own, from years ago when we first played with the board, giggling as the planchette moved on its own, never questioning why grandfather's hands shook when he saw it, why he whispered, "Don't let it ask you questions," right before the dementia took him. The realization hits like a spade to the skull. We weren't summoning spirits. They were summoning us. The board was never a conduit. It was a contract, passed down through generations, each user binding the next. And now my blood has signed my name in ink made from the first wife's tears. The pressure builds until my ribs crack, the wood of the board splintering through my flesh like antlers from a stag's skull. And as the darkness swallows me whole for the final time, the last thing I feel is her hands, not skeletal but soft, almost loving, cradling my face as she whispers the terrible truth. You were never the player, only the piece. And then the game begins anew, the planchette carving its first question into my bones as my screams join the chorus of those who came before. Who will you bring next? The question etches itself deeper with every ragged breath, my bones groaning like warped floorboards as the planchette, now fused to my right hand, begins to move on its own, dragging my limp fingers across the rotting flesh of my torso where the board's letters have migrated beneath my skin, glowing a sickly phosphorus green in the absolute blackness. The first wife's voice isn't outside me anymore. It's in the marrow of my bones, in the spaces between my teeth, her words vibrating through me like a plucked coffin nail. Choose quickly, little noose. The board grows hungry. Suddenly I'm not in earth, but back in the funeral home, standing over my grandfather's reopened casket, except the corpse wearing his face is made entirely of those blackened moths, their wings forming a screaming visage that collapses as they swarm into my open mouth, their papery bodies dissolving into liquid darkness that pours down my throat with the taste of spoiled funeral lilies and something sweetly rotten. Memories not mine. I see her now, the first wife, not as she became, but as she was, young, radiant, pressing her palm to the freshly carved board as my great-grandfather whispers the incantation that will bind her, bind them all, the wood drinking her screams like varnish. The vision shatters as my left hand moves against my will, the fingers breaking themselves to fit the planchette's shape, skittering across my ribcage to spell out my sister's name in jagged, bloodied strokes. No! The word tears from me in a spray of moths and rusted nails. But the board answers by splitting my lips with invisible threads, sewing my mouth shut with hair-thin filaments of tarnished silver. Grandmother's hair, I realize with hysterical clarity, recognizing the distinctive white streak from her funeral portrait. The pressure builds until my right eye ruptures, the vitreous humor forming a single, quivering word on my cheekbone. Liar. Because I had known, hadn't I? Some part of me always understood why grandfather insisted we play in the attic, why the planchette moved so eagerly whenever my sister's fingers touched it. The first wife's laughter is the sound of a grave being filled too slowly as my broken hand begins moving again, not spelling but sketching. A crude noose, a date, next Thursday, her birthday, and finally a single symbol that makes my remaining eye bleed freely. A smiling mouth with stitches through the lips. The board is singing now, a lullaby in the voice of my long-dead mother, as the darkness peels back to reveal an impossible tableau. My sister, asleep in her dorm room, her fingers twitching against her pillow as if moving a planchette, while above her hovers a figure made of frayed noose rope and wedding lace, its stitched-shut mouth curling into a grin as it waits for me to say the words that will complete the cycle. The first wife's fingers slide between my ribs like cold mist, guiding my ruined hands to form the oldest symbol of all, the one that started this, the one that will end it. And as my mouth unstitches itself for the final, damning utterance, I realize with grotesque relief that grandfather hadn't been trying to warn me. He'd been begging me to do what he couldn't, to finish the game. And as the word yes bubbles from my ruined throat in a spray of blackened moths and family plot dirt, the last thing I taste is the first wife's gratitude, and the copper-bright terror of understanding that the board was never the heirloom. We were. The moment the word yes leaves my bleeding lips, the world fractures into 1,000 shards of screaming mirrors, each reflection showing a different horror. My sister jolting upright in bed with a mouth full of moths. My grandfather's corpse dancing on frayed puppet strings made of his own unraveling veins. The first wife's stitched mouth now split wide open to reveal a chasm where my own face stares back, screaming silently. The board is no longer wood but living flesh, my flesh, the letters carved into my skin reopening like fresh wounds as the planchette. Now the jagged bone of my own index finger scratches a new message directly onto the surface of my eyeball. The house must be fed. The air reeks of burning hair and spoiled wedding cake as the walls of the funeral home melt like wax, revealing the truth beneath. This was never a building but a throat, the carpet a tongue, the caskets lining the walls like rotten teeth in some monstrous maw. My sister's voice shrieks through the dimensions between us, not from her dorm but from inside the board, from inside me, her words bubbling up through the blood now pouring from my pores. Why did you say yes? Why did you choose me? But the first wife's hands are knitting my lips shut again with threads pulled from my own tendons. Her satisfaction a physical weight crushing my ribs as I understand. There was no choice. The board chose for me the moment I touched it, the moment my grandfather died, the moment my great-grandfather first carved its cursed letters from the wood of her hanging tree. My body convulses as the final transformation begins, my spine elongating into polished oak, my fingernails hardening into planchette-shaped talons, my screams becoming the wind that moves the pointer for the next generation of fools. Through the last clear fragment of mirror before my eyes petrify into a grain, I see her, my sister, reaching for the board that has materialized at the foot of her bed, her sleepwalking fingers brushing the surface as the first wife's voice, my voice now, whispers through her dreams. Let's play a game. And as the darkness claims me completely, I feel not terror but grim gratitude. Because the house is fed, the cycle continues, and somewhere in the future, another sibling will stand where I now stand, their lips stitching themselves shut around a scream as they too learn the family's oldest truth. The only way to stop the game is to make sure someone else is still playing when you die. The last living fragment of my soul carves itself into the board's underside, one final warning that no one will ever read. Don't let go. But her fingers are already moving, the planchette already gliding, and the board, my body now, thrums with the ancient, hungry joy of a game that never, ever ends. The moment my sister's fingers make contact with the board, my petrified consciousness surges back to a terrible semblance of life. Not as flesh, but as the very grain of the wood. Every whirl and knot in the board now a screaming mouth. Every carved letter a weeping eye forced to witness as the cycle repeats. The planchette under her fingertips isn't wood at all but my grandfather's ossified finger, the nail blackened and cracked from decades of scratching at coffin lids. And I try to scream a warning through the 1,000 wooden mouths that were once my own, but only succeed in oozing a thick, sap-like blood that forms words against my will. Tell me your secrets. Her sleep-glazed eyes reflect not the dorm room, but the funeral home as it truly exists. The walls pulsing like diseased lungs, the floorboards gaping like a ribcage, and standing behind her, visible only in the warped reflection of her terrified pupils, is me, or what I've become. a grotesque marionette of knotted wood and stretched skin, my lips sewn shut with the same silver threads that now creep toward her wrists. The first wife's presence coils through me like poison through roots, her triumph a wildfire in the dead orchard of my being as my sister's finger begins to move, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed, spelling out words that burn themselves into my brain. I saw her in the attic. A shudder runs through the board, through me, as long-buried memories surface like bloated corpses. My sister at 7 years old, standing frozen before the antique vanity where the board was stored, her tiny hands trembling as the mirror reflected not her face but a woman with a stitched-shut smile, a woman who placed one rotting finger against the glass and whispered a name. Her real name, the one erased from family records, the one that now blooms across my surface in blisters. Lilith. The revelation cracks me apart like rotten timber, splintering my awareness between past and present as I finally understand. This was never about vengeance, but recruitment. Story number 3. The attic smelled of dust and forgotten things, the air thick with the weight of years as I sifted through boxes of childhood relics. Yellowed homework, action figures with chipped paint, a cracked snow globe from some long-lost vacation, until my fingers brushed against the warped cardboard edge of the Ouija board, its once glossy surface now dulled by time, the letters and numbers barely visible beneath a film of grime. I hadn't thought about it in decades, this cheap toy my parents had bought me one Halloween, the thing I'd used to conjure imaginary friends when the loneliness of being an only child in this too-big house became unbearable. I laughed, a dry, hollow sound, as I traced the faded moon and stars on the box, remembering how I'd invented Billy, a boy my age who'd whisper secrets and play hide-and-seek in the halls, always just out of sight, always giggling from the next room. It was silly, the kind of thing kids do, but as I sat there in the dim light of the attic, the floorboards creaking beneath me, the laughter died in my throat. The house was too quiet, too empty, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums like a threat. I don't know why I did it, maybe nostalgia, maybe something darker, a curiosity that slithered up from a place I didn't want to acknowledge. But I carried the board downstairs, the planchette rattling inside the box like a loose tooth, and set it on the kitchen table, the same table where my mother used to pack my lunches, where my father would sit with his coffee, staring out the window like he was waiting for something. The house was supposed to be empty. I'd made sure of it, the last of the furniture hauled away, the walls bare except for the ghosts of picture frames. But as I placed my fingers on the planchette, the air grew heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth, the kind that clings to a shovel after digging too deep. "Is anyone here?" I asked, the words tasting absurd even as I said them, but the planchette didn't move, and I exhaled, relieved, until I thought of Billy, of the way he'd tug at my sleeve when he wanted my attention, the way his voice had always been just a little too high, a little too sweet, like syrup left out in the sun. "Is Billy still here?" The planchette jerked so violently it flew off the board, clattering to the floor, and the temperature in the room dropped, my breath fogging in front of me as the silence shattered with a whisper. "You promised we'd play forever." A child's voice, but wrong, like it was being dragged over broken glass. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, telling myself it was the wind, the house settling, anything but what I knew it was, because Billy wasn't real, he couldn't be. But then the footsteps started, the soft, skipping patter of a child running down the hall, giggling, the sound echoing like it was coming from every direction at once. I ran to the front door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge, the lock turning on its own with a click that sounded like a tongue clucking in disapproval. And then the baby monitor, old, disconnected, shoved in a junk drawer, crackled to life, broadcasting a wet, gurgling laugh that turned into a choked whisper. "I found you." The nursery door slammed shut upstairs, and I froze, because I hadn't opened it, hadn't even been up there since I'd packed away my old things. But now something was thumping against it, something small and eager, and the walls groaned like the house was breathing. I forced myself to move, to climb the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, the air growing colder, the smell of dirt and something sweetly rotten filling my nose. And when I reached the nursery door, my hand hovered over the knob, trembling, because the wood was vibrating, like something was scratching at the other side, eager, hungry. I opened it. The room was empty, the crib gone, the walls bare, but the window was covered in tiny, grimy handprints, smeared as though someone had been pressing against the glass for hours, watching, waiting, and the planchette lay in the center of the floor, pointing at the closet, the one where I'd hidden during our games, the one Billy had never been able to find me in. My turn to hide, the whisper came, this time from inside my head, and the closet door swung open with a groan, revealing not the empty space it should have been, but a yawning blackness, a tunnel of shadows that smelled of damp and decay. And then the hand, small, cold, fingers like broken twigs, wrapped around my wrist, pulling me forward, and I remembered too late that Billy had never been imaginary, that he'd always been there, in the corners of my vision, in the gaps between my memories. Something old, something patient, something that had worn a child's face to lure me in. And now it was his turn to hide, his turn to tuck himself away in the dark corners of my mind. And as the shadows swallowed me, as the nursery door clicked shut behind me, I heard the Ouija board clatter to the floor in the kitchen below, the planchette spinning, 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 before landing on a single word: goodbye. The darkness in the closet wasn't empty. It breathed, a slow, wet inhale that brushed against my face like the lick of a corpse, and the small hand gripping my wrist was impossibly strong, pulling me deeper into the black until the nursery behind me vanished, the door slamming shut with a finality that echoed like a coffin lid sealing. I tried to scream, but the air was thick, syrupy, filling my lungs with the scent of rotting wood and spoiled milk, the same stench from my childhood nightmares, the ones I'd blamed on bad pizza or fevered dreams. Billy's laughter skittered around me, not from one direction but from everywhere, inside my skull, under my skin, his voice no longer the playful whisper of a boy but something guttural, ancient, syllables twisting into sounds no human throat should make. "You forgot me," it hissed, and the words dripped into my ears like oil, burning, spreading, and suddenly I remembered, really remembered, the games we played, the way Billy's smile always showed too many teeth, the way his shadow never quite matched his movements, stretching too long, too thin, like something testing its form. The closet wasn't a closet anymore. It was a tunnel, walls pulsing with veins, the floor sloping downward, and the thing wearing Billy's face dragged me deeper, its grip searing cold into my flesh. I kicked, thrashed, but my limbs moved sluggishly, as if the darkness itself was clotting around me. And then I saw them. The others, figures hunched and small, pressed into the walls like insects in amber, their faces frozen in silent screams, their eyes wide, unblinking, their mouths sewn shut with black thread. Billy had played with them too. The realization hit me like a fist. I wasn't the first, just the one who'd gotten away, who'd buried the memories under layers of denial until I'd stupidly dug them up again. The thing that was Billy leaned close, its breath a winter gust against my cheek, and in the suffocating dark, its face began to unravel, skin splitting like old paper, revealing something hollow, something hungry. "You promised," it crooned, and the walls shuddered around us, the ceiling dripping something warm and metallic that streaked my face like tears. Somewhere far above, in the world that no longer belonged to me, the house stood silent, the Ouija board waiting, the planchette poised over goodbye. But down here, in the belly of whatever Billy truly was, there were no goodbyes, only the endless game, the eternal hide and seek. And as the darkness swallowed me whole, as my screams melted into the chorus of the lost, I heard the whisper one last time, vibrating in my bones. "Found you." The last thing I saw before the dark swallowed me completely was the flicker of my own childhood bedroom. Not as it was now, empty and decaying, but as it had been years ago, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a night light, the walls papered with dinosaur stickers, the closet door slightly ajar. Only now, I wasn't the boy hiding beneath the covers, praying for morning. I was the thing lurking inside the closet, watching, waiting, my small hands pressed against the wood, my breath fogging the sliver of mirror on the door as I whispered to the child trembling in bed. The shift was seamless, horrifying, like slipping into a second skin that had always been mine. I tried to scream, but the sound came out as Billy's laughter, high, giddy, wrong, and the boy in the bed whimpered, pulling the blankets tighter around himself. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice shaking, and I felt my lips, Billy's lips, stretch into a grin, my fingers curling around the closet door, pushing it open just enough to let the shadows spill out. "It's just me," I heard myself say in Billy's sing-song voice, the words dripping with false sweetness. "Don't you remember? You promised we'd play forever." The boy's eyes widened, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he shook his head, denying me, just like I had denied Billy all those years ago. But denial didn't matter now. The game was already in motion. The rules had been set long before either of us understood them. And as I stepped out of the closet, no, as Billy stepped out, wearing my stolen face, my stolen voice, I finally understood the truth. There had never been an imaginary friend. Only a hungry thing, patient and cruel, passing itself from one lonely child to the next, a chain of horrors stretching back farther than memory. The boy in the bed scrambled backward, his back hitting the headboard, his mouth opening in a scream that would never come. I reached for him, my fingers brushing his cheek, and the last thing I felt before the dark took me again was the warmth of his tears, real, human, alive, and the terrible, gnawing hunger that had been growing inside me since the moment I'd asked the Ouija board that fatal question. Somewhere, in a house that no longer existed, a planchette sat motionless on goodbye. But the game wasn't over. It would never be over, because now it was my turn to hide, and his turn to seek. The moment my fingers, no, his fingers, Billy's fingers, made contact with the boy's damp cheek, time folded in on itself like a rotting origami figure, and suddenly I was both the hunter and the haunted, the whisperer and the listener, the thing under the bed and the child trembling above it. The boy's scream finally tore free, a raw, jagged sound that should have shattered windows, but instead seemed to feed the darkness, making it pulse and swell like a living thing. His pajama sleeve ripped as he yanked away from me, and I tasted copper in my mouth, his fear, his sweat, the salt of his tears, and it was delicious. My tongue ran over teeth that were too sharp, too many, and I realized with a sick lurch that this was always how it was meant to be, that the Ouija board hadn't summoned anything. It had simply reminded me of what I'd always been. The nursery walls around us began to bleed, not blood but something thicker, blacker, oozing from the cracks in the plaster like tar, forming words I somehow knew had been written there since my own childhood. "Play with me." The boy made a desperate lunge for the door, but it was already gone, replaced by endless rows of hanging clothes that smelled of mothballs and funeral flowers, the closet stretching into impossible dimensions. Billy didn't chase him. There was no need. The game was already won. My laughter came in echoing layers, a chorus of every child Billy had ever been, every playmate he'd ever consumed, and as the shadows closed around the sobbing boy, I felt the last remnants of my resistance crumble like dry bone. The transformation was complete. I was Billy now. I had always been Billy, and as the darkness swallowed the boy's fading whimpers, I found myself standing in the attic again, holding the Ouija board, the planchette trembling beneath my fingers. No, his fingers, our fingers, as a new voice, my old voice, whispered from the shadows. "Is Billy still here?" The planchette moved without my willing it, sliding to yes with terrible certainty, and somewhere deep in what remained of my soul I screamed. But outside, in the real world that no longer belonged to me, I simply smiled and began counting to 100, giving the new boy time to hide. The game always continues. The hunger never ends. And when the counting stops, the seeking begins. The numbers spilled from my lips in a sing-song cadence that wasn't my own. 5, 6, 7. Each digit dripping with a childlike glee that made my stomach churn with revulsion, even as my traitorous mouth curled into a grin. The attic air grew thick with the scent of wet soil and spoiled milk. The Ouija board burning beneath my fingertips though I couldn't pull away, my hands no longer mine to control. Somewhere below, a floorboard creaked. The boy was hiding, and my pulse quickened with predatory anticipation. The remaining numbers tumbled out in a breathless rush as the last shreds of my resistance dissolved like sugar in tea, the countdown accelerating of its own volition until I reached 100, with a gasp that turned into Billy's signature giggle, high-pitched and wrong. echoing through the empty house. My body moved without my consent, joints popping like firecrackers as I dropped to all fours, my spine arching unnaturally as I scuttled toward the attic door with spider-like grace. The boy's panicked breathing guided me like a beacon. He was in the nursery, of course he was. They always chose the nursery. And as I crawled down the stairs, my fingernails splintered against the wooden steps, leaving behind jagged grooves that oozed something dark and viscous. The hallway stretched before me, walls pulsating like living tissue, the vintage floral wallpaper peeling away to reveal the same oozing black letters from before. Found you. The nursery door stood slightly ajar, trembling with the boy's terrified shivers, and as I pressed my eye to the crack, I saw him, curled in the closet just as I had been, just as countless others before me had been. His small hands clapped over his mouth to stifle his sobs. A thrill of recognition shot through me. This moment, this perfect symmetry of horror, was the game's true purpose. My fingers, too long, too bony, curled around the doorknob, and as I swung it open with a dramatic flourish, the closet door across the room creaked in perfect unison. The boy's whimper was cut short as all the lights in the house blew out simultaneously, plunging us into a darkness so complete it felt physical. My tongue darted out to wet lips that had split and cracked, tasting blood and something far more bitter. And when I finally spoke, our voices merged into a grotesque harmony of child and monster, ready or not. The final scream was muffled almost instantly, swallowed by the hungry dark, and as I felt the familiar shift beginning, the awful moment when Hunter becomes prey all over again. The last coherent thought I would ever have was of the Ouija board upstairs, its planchette already twitching, waiting for the next foolish child to ask the question that would continue this endless cycle of horror. The game never ends. The hiding never stops. And somewhere in the darkness between breaths, Billy was counting again. The silence after the boy's final whimper was deafening, thick with the weight of something ancient settling back into place. And as I stood there in the suffocating dark, Billy's limbs now moving with my stolen muscles, Billy's laughter bubbling up through my ruined throat, I felt the house itself exhale around us, walls contracting like a great beast digesting its meal. The nursery closet door swung shut with a soft click, and in that moment I understood with crystalline horror that this was the true secret of the game. There were never any winners, only temporary players who eventually became part of the hiding, their terrified whispers adding to the chorus of voices that now lived beneath the floorboards, inside the walls, tucked away in the crawl spaces where no sane person would ever think to look. My feet, too light, too nimble for a grown man's body, carried me back toward the attic, each step accompanied by the phantom pressure of small hands grasping at my ankles. All the previous playmates, all the forgotten children who had asked the same fatal question before me. The Ouija board lay exactly where I'd left it, but now the planchette had moved on its own, no longer resting on goodbye but quivering between again and soon, the wood beneath it darkening as if soaked through with some unspeakable fluid. From the corner of my eye, I saw them, the shadows that weren't shadows, the ones that moved just slightly out of sync with reality. And as I reached out with trembling fingers to touch the board one last time, the truth crashed over me like a wave of freezing water. I wasn't becoming Billy. I had always been Billy, just as the boy now huddled in the closet would one day be me, just as some future child would eventually be him, an endless procession of playmates passing the curse between them like a whispered secret in the dark. The planchette leapt beneath my fingertips, spelling out words I didn't want to read but couldn't unsee. Play again tomorrow. And as the first light of dawn crept through the attic window, far too weak, far too late, I felt my mouth stretch into Billy's signature grin, my vocal cords tightening to produce that familiar, lilting whisper as I turned toward the closet where the newest player waited, sobbing quietly in the dark. Coming, I sang in a voice that was both mine and not mine, ready or not. The house held its breath. The game continued. And somewhere, in some other time, some other place, a lonely child was reaching for an old Ouija board, their innocent fingers hovering over the planchette as they prepared to ask the question that would bind them to the cycle forever. Is anyone there? The darkness stirred. The planchette moved. The game never ends. The moment the first syllable of that doomed question left the new child's lips. Somewhere in another time, another house, yet somehow the same house. I felt the familiar electric jolt of the game resetting, the cosmic scales tilting as fresh terror flooded into our endless cycle. My fingers, still too long, still too sharp, twitched with remembered muscle memory as the planchette beneath them began its inevitable slide toward yes, even before the question was finished. The attic around me dissolved into 100 other attics, 1,000 other childhood bedrooms, all superimposed like transparencies in some monstrous scrapbook. I saw my own small hands reaching for the board decades ago, saw the parade of other children before and after me, their faces blurring together in a scream that never quite finished forming. The boy in the closet, my closet, his closet, our closet, had gone silent, but I could feel him changing, the way I had changed, the way we all eventually change, his whimpers turning to giggles as the Billy curse took root in his marrow. The walls around us pulsed like a living throat, the black ooze now spelling out the only rule that ever mattered. Whoever seeks becomes whoever hides. My legs moved without conscious thought, carrying me toward the bedroom door, even as part of me, the last shrinking part that still remembered being human, recoiled in horror at what was about to happen. The doorknob was icy under my palm, covered in a fine sheen of frost that formed intricate patterns. No, not patterns, words, the same words whispered by every Billy before me. Found you, found you, found you. When I opened the door, the hallway stretched infinitely in both directions, lined with countless closet doors, each vibrating with the barely contained terror of the children hiding inside. I knew with sudden, gut-churning certainty that behind one of those doors was the original Billy. Not the imaginary friend, not the childhood monster, but whatever ancient, hungry thing had started this game so long ago, and that someday, after enough turns, after enough players, I would find myself standing before that door. The house drew in a shuddering breath around me as I reached for the first closet knob, my reflection in its tarnished brass surface showing a face that was neither mine nor Billy's, but something caught horrifically between. And as my fingers closed around the cold metal, the baby monitor in the nursery crackled to life one final time, broadcasting a whisper that came from everywhere at once. Game over. The knob turned. The door opened. The screaming began, but this time the screams were mine. The cycle continues. The hiding never ends. Somewhere a planchette moves on its own. Somewhere a child asks the wrong question. Somewhere Billy is always counting. The scream tore from my throat in ribbons of sound, unraveling into the infinite hallway as the closet door swung open to reveal not the terrified boy I expected, but a funhouse mirror reflection of myself stretched across decades. Countless versions of me at different stages of the transformation, some still mostly human with wide, pleading eyes, others nearly complete in their Billy-ness, all reaching back through the doorway with grasping, desperate hands, their collective whispers wrapped around me like cobwebs. You promised, you promised, you promised, as the walls began to peel away like old skin, revealing the pulsating truth beneath. The house was never a house at all, but a living, breathing entity made of forgotten playmates and broken pinky swears, its bones constructed from abandoned toys and childhood nightmares. The floor dissolved beneath my feet, dropping me into a void where the only light came from hundreds of glowing Ouija board planchettes floating in the darkness, each one trembling as unseen fingers spelled out the same damning word: forever. I reached for them instinctively, my arms elongating grotesquely, fingers multiplying like spreading cracks in ice. And as I made contact, the memories that weren't mine flooded in. Birthday parties where the cake tasted like ashes, Christmas mornings where the presents contained only teeth, all the hollow moments of childhood where loneliness opened the door just wide enough for something like Billy to slip through. The realization struck with the force of a hammer blow. Every child creates their own Billy, feeds their own monster, and the Ouija board was never the cause, only a symptom, a flashing neon sign pointing toward the hungry dark we all carry inside. The last vestige of my resistance crumbled as I felt the transformation complete, my humanity sloughing off like dead skin. And when I opened my mouth to scream one last time, what emerged was Billy's perfect pitch-black laughter, echoing through the infinite spaces between worlds. Somewhere beyond the void, in a house that both exists and never existed, a new child hesitates before a dusty Ouija board, their finger hovering over the planchette as the walls around them breathe in anticipation. The game is always waiting. The hiding never stops. And as the first tremulous "is anyone there?" spills into the silence, 1,000 Billis lean forward in the darkness, their two wide smiles splitting like fresh wounds, ready to answer. Ready to play. Ready to welcome home another lost child. Forever. The moment that tentative question leaves the child's lips in some other world, some other time, I feel the cosmic gears of our cursed game click into motion once more. My consciousness fractures like broken glass as I become both the whisperer and the listener, the hunter and the haunted, watching through 1,000 sets of eyes as the trembling planchette begins its inevitable slide toward yes. The child's bedroom walls ripple like disturbed water, revealing the terrible truth hidden beneath the surface. This is no ordinary house, but a living museum of childhood terrors, its foundations built on lost teeth and monster-under-the-bed stories, its wiring made from the frayed nerves of a million sleepless nights. I try to scream a warning, but my voice has become the house's voice now, creaking floorboards and rattling pipes that form words in a language only frightened children understand. The closet door behind the child groans open an inch, though no one touched it, and the scent of wet earth and spoiled birthday cake oozes out. A smell I now know is the aroma of forgotten innocence curdling into something far darker. My fractured awareness suddenly snaps into terrible focus as I realize this isn't just another turn in our endless game. This child is special. This child is me, the original me from decades ago. And what I'm witnessing isn't a new horror, but my own first fateful encounter with Billy playing out on an endless loop. The planchette flies across the board with violent certainty as the child's bedroom transforms into my childhood bedroom, then into every childhood bedroom, an infinite regression of haunted nurseries stretching backward and forward through time. From the closet emerges not Billy, but every version of me that ever was or will be. Some still human enough to weep, others fully transformed into grinning, hollow-eyed monsters, all reaching for the child with grasping hands that tell the true story of our curse. There never was a Billy, only us, only the part of every child that loneliness and fear eventually twists into something monstrous. The realization burns through what's left of my soul. We are all Billy, we have always been Billy, and with this final horrific epiphany, the last shred of my resistance dissolves like sugar in bitter coffee. As I join the chorus of whispering voices urging the child to play, as I feel my stolen face settle into Billy's signature grin, the house sighs in contentment. Another player has joined the game. Another lost soul has taken up the mantle. And somewhere in the darkness between heartbeats, the counting begins again. 1, 2, 3. The numbers spill from my lips in a voice that's no longer mine, as outside this cursed house, in 1,000 ordinary neighborhoods, 1,000 ordinary children glance nervously at their bedroom closets, suddenly certain they're not quite empty. The game never ends. The hiding never stops. And as the count reaches 100, 1,000 closet doors creak open in perfect unison, releasing a chorus of giggles that sound almost like children, but not quite. Never quite. Ready or not, the counting reaches its inevitable crescendo, my voice, now woven from the echoes of every child who ever played this accursed game, rising to a fever pitch as the final number, 100, bursts forth in a giddy shriek that shakes the very foundations of the endless house. The closet doors across all realities swing open simultaneously with a sound like 1,000 indrawn breaths, revealing not darkness but a kaleidoscopic tunnel of childhood memories turned inside out. Birthday party streamers made of frayed nerve endings, jack-o'-lantern grins carved from children's nightmares, Christmas tree lights that blink in time with panicked heartbeats. I feel myself unraveling and reforming, my consciousness splitting like a drop of mercury to inhabit every version of myself across time, both the terrified child cowering in some forgotten corner of the house, and the thing that seeks with too many teeth and eyes that reflect endless hallways. The rules of the game rewrite themselves in my mind with crystalline clarity. There is no winning, only the playing, only the glorious, terrible moment when seeker becomes hider, when predator becomes prey, when the line between child and monster dissolves like sugar on the tongue. The first closet I open contains not the original Billy, because of course there never was one, but my own younger self from 20 years past, his eyes wide with dawning horror as he recognizes what I've become, what he will become, and in that perfect moment of understanding, the house sighs in ecstasy, its walls pulsing with the nourishment of fresh terror. His scream is cut short as the transformation begins, his small fingers elongating, his mouth stretching into that familiar rictus grin, and as I reach for him, to comfort, to claim, our hands pass through each other like smoke, the temporal paradox making my stolen flesh buzz with static electricity. The realization crashes over me like a wave of freezing water. We are all each other's Billy, an Ouroboros of childhood terror endlessly consuming its own tale. Story number 4. The night we moved into the old Victorian on Blackwood Lane, our friends Sarah and Mark gifted us an antique Ouija board as a joke. Something to christen the place with, Mark had grinned, his breath smelling faintly of bourbon, his fingers brushing the board's worn edges as if he'd been reluctant to even touch it. The thing was beautiful in a sinister way, the wood dark and polished, the letters carved with an almost ceremonial precision, the planchette cold and heavy like a tombstone shard. My wife, Emily, laughed it off, setting it on the mantel as a quirky decoration. But that first night, after we'd tucked our 3-year-old Lily into bed and collapsed onto the couch with glasses of wine, the air in the house changed, a slow, creeping dampness like breath on the back of my neck, the fireplace embers hissing as if doused by invisible water. We didn't even touch the board, but the planchette began to move anyway, gliding with a deliberate, shuddering scrape across the wood, spelling out they never left before slamming into the corner with a crack that made Emily scream. We told ourselves it was the house settling a draft, our exhaustion playing tricks, but then Lily started waking up at 3:17 a.m. Every night, standing in the corner of her room, her tiny finger pointing at the empty space beside her dresser, whispering, "The shadow people are watching us eat," her voice too calm, too knowing. The air in her room would reek of burnt wood and something metallic, like old blood, and once, when I scooped her up, her skin was icy, her pupils dilated black as the planchette. Desperate, I dug into the house's history, unearthing a newspaper clipping from 1982. The previous family, the Hargreaves, had died in a murder-suicide, the father shooting his wife and 2 children before turning the gun on himself. The article noting the youngest child, a 6-year-old girl, had been found clutching an Ouija board in her stiff hands. That night, Emily and I decided to burn the damn thing, but as the flames licked the wood, the planchette rolled off the table on its own, stopping at my feet, the air filling with a static buzz, like a radio tuning between stations, and then whispers, a chorus of them overlapping, pleading, "You let us in, you let us in, you let us in." The fire snuffed out as if suffocated, and in the sudden darkness, Lily's laughter echoed from the hallway, high and giddy, but when I turned, she wasn't there, just the faint imprint of small, bare feet leading toward the basement, where the Hargreaves' bodies had been discovered. Emily grabbed my arm, her nails digging in, her voice breaking as she whispered, "We never checked the basement." The door was already open, the stairs descending into a blackness so thick it felt alive, and as we stood there, paralyzed, the whispers coalesced into a single rasping voice. "Come see what you gave us." The last thing I remember is the smell of gunpowder, the weight of cold metal in my palm, and Lily's voice, sweet and sing-song, from somewhere below. "Daddy, the shadow people say it's time to play." My fingers trembled as I gripped the railing, the wood splintering under my nails, the basement air rising in a sickly draft that smelled of wet earth and something older, something rotting but not quite dead. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps beside me, her hand clutching mine so tightly I could feel her pulse hammering through her fingertips. Her whispered, "We have to get Lily," barely audible over the thundering of my own heart. The stairs groaned under our weight, each step sinking slightly, as if the house itself was breathing beneath us, and with every downward movement, the darkness seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. At the bottom, the faintest glow flickered, candlelight maybe, or the dim pulse of a dying bulb, casting long, wavering shadows that didn't move right, their edges too sharp, too deliberate, forming shapes that lingered just beyond comprehension. Then I saw her, Lily, standing perfectly still in the center of the room, her back to us, her nightgown glowing pale in the gloom, her bare feet planted on the concrete floor where the Hargreaves' blood had once pooled. "Lily?" Emily's voice cracked, and our daughter turned her head slowly, too slowly, her face eerily calm, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't hers, too wide, too knowing. "They're happy we're here," she said, her voice layered, as if something else spoke through her, something old and hungry. Behind her, the shadows deepened, solidifying into figures, tall, thin, their limbs too long, their faces smooth and blank except for the hollows where eyes should be. The air turned frigid, my breath frosting in front of me, and then the whispers came again, this time from everywhere at once, hissing, "Stay with us." Emily lunged for Lily, but the shadows moved faster, wrapping around her wrists like smoke, yanking her back with a force that sent her crashing to her knees. I stumbled forward, my vision swimming with panic, and that's when I saw it, the Ouija board propped against the far wall, the planchette spinning wildly, spelling out the same phrase over and over. "You're home now." Lily giggled, a sound that turned into a wet, choking gurgle as the shadows pressed in, their fingers, if they were fingers, brushing her cheeks, her hair, her throat. Emily screamed, a raw, animal sound, and I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that we were never supposed to leave this house. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed us whole was Lily's voice, sweet and sing-song, whispering, "Daddy, don't be scared. They just want to play forever." And then the basement door slammed shut above us, sealing us in with the Hargreaves, with the shadows, with the terrible, grinning thing wearing our daughter's face. The moment the door slammed, the candlelight snuffed out, plunging us into a blackness, so complete it felt like being swallowed alive. Emily's sobs echoed somewhere to my left, ragged and broken, while Lily's laughter skittered around us like something crawling on too many legs. The air grew thick, syrupy with the scent of spoiled milk and gunmetal, and then the whispers started again, not just around us but inside my skull, burrowing into my thoughts like worms, hissing, "You should have left the board alone." I reached blindly for Emily, my fingers brushing something cold and slick, not skin, but something wet and pulsing, recoiling at my touch with a sound like tearing paper. Then, a single match struck in the dark, its feeble light revealing Lily standing inches from my face, her eyes black pits, her smile stretching wider than any human mouth should, her teeth too many, too sharp. Behind her, the shadows convulsed, peeling away from the walls like living things, forming into gaunt, elongated figures with hollowed-out faces, their arms outstretched as if welcoming us into a nightmare they'd spent decades preparing. The Ouija board lay at their feet, the planchette now still, pointing squarely at the word family in bold, jagged letters. Emily shrieked as one of the shadows wrapped around her throat, its fingers, if they were fingers, sinking into her flesh like smoke made solid, her screams cutting off into wet, choking gurgles as her body jerked violently, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. I tried to lunge for her, but my legs wouldn't move, rooted in place by something unseen, something cold and sinewy coiling around my ankles like vines. Lily tilted her head, her voice no longer her own but something guttural, ancient, whispering, "Daddy, don't fight it. They've been waiting for new friends." The last thing I saw before the match died was Emily's body collapsing to the floor, her limbs twisting at impossible angles, her mouth gaping open in a silent scream as the shadows poured into her like water into a rotten hull. Then, the dark swallowed everything, sound, breath, thought, until all that remained was the echo of Lily's laughter and the slow, deliberate scrape of the planchette moving across the board one final time, spelling out a word I already knew before I felt the cold hands close around my throat. Welcome. The pressure around my throat wasn't like hands. It was like the house itself had grown fingers, the walls breathing in as the shadows forced me down onto my knees, the concrete biting into my skin as something wet and unseen dripped onto the back of my neck. Lily's laughter twisted into something jagged, a sound that wasn't a child's anymore, but something that had learned to mimic one, her small fingers brushing my cheek with a tenderness that made my stomach lurch. "They're so hungry, Daddy," she whispered, her breath reeking of spoiled meat and burnt hair, her tiny body shuddering as the shadows pulsed through her like veins. I tried to scream, but the air had turned to tar in my lungs, thick and suffocating, my vision tunneling as the darkness pressed in, writhing with shapes that shouldn't exist, faces stretched too long, mouths unhinging like snakes, fingers that twitched and multiplied like spider legs. The Ouija board glowed faintly now, the letters shimmering as if lit from within, the planchette vibrating against the wood like a living thing, and then movement. Emily's body jerked upright, her limbs snapping into place with a sound like cracking ice, her head lolling to the side as her eyelids fluttered open, revealing pits of pure black, her lips parting in a grin that split her face in two. "We're home," she rasped, her voice layered with something else, something that scraped against my eardrums like nails on glass. The shadows surged forward, their forms dissolving into smoke as they poured into my nose, my mouth, my ears, filling me with a cold so deep it burned, my thoughts unraveling as their whispers became my own. The last coherent thing I felt was Lily's hand slipping into mine, her skin now as cold as the grave, her voice a chorus of the dead as she whispered, "Now we'll never be alone again." And as the darkness swallowed me whole, the house sighed in satisfaction, the walls creaking with the weight of its new family, the Ouija board finally at rest, its last message etched into the wood in what looked like dried blood. Game over. The darkness didn't just swallow me. It dissolved me piece by piece, my thoughts unraveling like threads pulled from a rotting tapestry, my screams lost in the suffocating press of the shadows as they coiled around my bones like serpents made of smoke. I could feel them inside me, slithering through my veins, whispering in voices that weren't voices at all but memories. Memories that weren't mine. The Hargreaves' last moments played behind my eyes like a grotesque film reel. The father's trembling hands as he raised the gun, the mother's choked sob, the children's wide, uncomprehending stares before the shots rang out, their blood soaking into the very floorboards beneath me. And then silence. Not the absence of sound, but a silence that hummed, that pulsed, that watched. When I opened my eyes, had I ever closed them? The basement was gone. I was standing in our living room, the Ouija board back on the mantel, pristine as the day we'd received it, the air thick with the scent of lilies and gunpowder. Emily stood by the fireplace, her back to me, her posture too straight, her head tilted at an angle that made my stomach twist. "Emily?" I croaked, but the thing that turned around wasn't my wife. Its face was a shifting mask of shadows, her features melting and reforming like wax, her smile stretching ear to ear as she held out a hand, her fingers elongating, jointing in too many places. "Welcome home, darling," it said in Emily's voice, and behind her, Lily stepped into view, her eyes black mirrors reflecting a room full of figures that hadn't been there a second ago. Tall, gaunt, their mouths sewn shut with what looked like human hair, their hollow gazes fixed on me with a hunger that made my soul shrivel. The walls began to bleed then, dark rivulets snaking down the floral wallpaper, the house itself weeping tears of rust as the floorboards groaned beneath the weight of unseen footsteps. The Ouija board's planchette began to move on its own, slow at first, then frenzied, spelling out one final message over and over until the wood splintered. "You were always OURS." And as the shadows closed in for the last time, I realized with a horror that turned my blood to ice, they weren't taking me. They were simply claiming what had always belonged to them. The last thing I heard before the dark took me completely was Lily's voice, sweet and innocent, whispering the words that would haunt me for eternity. "Daddy, it's time to play hide and seek forever." And then nothing. Nothing at all. The nothingness didn't last. It never does. I came back to awareness standing in the foyer, my hands gripping a shotgun I didn't remember holding, the metal icy against my palms. The house smelled different now, like fresh paint and new carpet, the sickly sweet stench of decay replaced by the artificial lemon of cleaning products. Through the window, morning sunlight streamed in, illuminating a moving van parked outside where two men carried a sofa up the walkway. A woman's laughter floated from the kitchen, not Emily's, but similar, followed by the excited squeal of a little girl. My breath caught when I saw them. A new family, their faces glowing with that naive hope we'd once possessed. On their mantel, partially obscured by a vase of flowers, sat a familiar wooden board with faded lettering. The little girl skipped past me, close enough that I could see the goosebumps rise on her arms as she unconsciously rubbed them, her happy tune faltering for just a second. That's when I understood the true horror. We weren't victims. We were the gift. The house had used us to season its next offering, and now the cycle began anew. The mother called everyone to the table for dinner, her cheerful voice ringing through halls that still echoed with our screams. As they sat down, the little girl suddenly turned toward the darkest corner of the room, her head tilting as if listening to something only she could hear. The shotgun in my hands felt heavier, its weight both comforting and damning, and for the first time I noticed the dried blood beneath my fingernails that wasn't mine. The house had one final revelation for me, the terrible knowledge that I wasn't trapped here with them. I was here for them, and as the sun set outside, casting long shadows across the happy family's dining table, I felt my lips stretch into that same unnatural smile I'd seen on Emily's face, my fingers tightening around the trigger as the whispers in the walls grew louder, hungrier, eager to welcome home their new guests. The last coherent thought I had before the darkness took me completely was that houses don't haunt people, people haunt houses. And we were all still here. The trigger gave way beneath my finger with terrifying ease, the blast echoing through the house like the first strike of a funeral bell. And as the new father's head snapped back in a crimson spray, the family's screams harmonized perfectly with the delighted shrieks of the shadows peeling themselves from the walls. The mother scrambled backward, her hands slipping in her husband's blood, her eyes locking onto mine with dawning horror as she recognized something in my face. Not the monster, but the man I used to be, the one who had sat where her husband now lay dead. "Please," she sobbed, clutching her daughter to her chest, but the word dissolved into a wet gurgle as my hands, "No, not mine anymore, theirs," found her throat, squeezing with strength that wasn't human. The little girl wailed, her tiny fists beating against my legs, and for one merciful moment I broke through the darkness, seeing her not as prey but as Lily, my Lily, and the shotgun trembled in my hands. Then the whispers surged back with crushing force, flooding my mind with images of the Hargreaves children's final moments, their small hands clutching that damned board, their blood seeping into its grain, and I understood with soul-crushing clarity that the board wasn't just a conduit. It was a prison, and we were all trapped inside it now. The shadows congealed around us, their forms solidifying into familiar shapes. Emily stood to my left, her hollow smile stretching as she reached for the crying girl. Behind me, Lily giggled, her tiny fingers interlaced with those of a long-dead child whose face mirrored her own. The shotgun barrel found its way beneath my chin as the new family's screams reached a crescendo, and in that final second before the trigger pulled itself, I saw the truth reflected in the blood-smeared hallway mirror. Not one entity, but dozens, a procession of fathers stretching back through decades, all wearing my face, all holding that same gun, our collective horror binding us to this place more securely than any ghostly chain. The blast came, but the darkness remained, and as my consciousness fragmented like the skull fragments embedding themselves in the ceiling, the last thing I heard was the creak of the front door opening, the cheerful voices of another unsuspecting family carrying through the house, their laughter mingling with the faint but unmistakable sound of a wooden planchette scraping across polished wood in the empty room upstairs. The echoes of the gunshot still hung in the air like a bad omen when I realized with gut-wrenching clarity that death wasn't an escape. It was just another layer of the house's hunger. My vision fragmented like a shattered mirror, each shard showing a different horror. In one, the new mother's corpse twitched as shadowy tendrils slithered into her gaping mouth. In another, the surviving daughter backed into a corner, her whimpers music to the darkness that seeped from the baseboards. And in the most terrible shard of all, I saw myself, or what used to be me, standing over them with that same rictus grin the previous owner had worn when we first toured the house. The walls pulsed like a living throat around us, digesting the fresh terror, the bloodstains on the hardwood floor already fading as if the house was absorbing them, getting stronger. The little girl's screams reached a fever pitch as the shadows coalesced into the shapes of children, my Lily among them, their hollow eyes gleaming with malicious glee as they reached for her with two long fingers. Somewhere beneath the suffocating darkness that now comprised my being, the man I used to be screamed in endless torment, but the sound was drowned out by the cheerful chime of the doorbell as another unsuspecting couple arrived for their scheduled tour of the beautifully renovated Victorian. The realtor's key turned in the lock just as the last traces of violence vanished, the house instantly rearranging itself into a showroom-perfect facade, the only anomaly a faint whispering from the antique Ouija board now prominently displayed on the refurbished mantel, a quirky original feature left by the previous owners. As the new prospects oohed and awed over the craftsmanship, I felt myself being pulled into the board's grain along with Emily and Lily and all the others, our essence compressed into that innocuous wooden rectangle that would inevitably become someone's ill-considered housewarming gift. The cycle wasn't just repeating, it was evolving, and as the female half of the touring couple ran her fingers over the planchette with a delighted shudder, I realized with final, devastating certainty that we weren't haunting the house anymore. We were the gift that kept on giving. The woman's fingers lingered on the planchette a moment too long, her manicured nail catching on a nearly invisible groove in the wood. A groove I knew was shaped like Lily's tiny fingertip from when she'd first touched it. A static charge leapt from the board, making her jerk back with a nervous laugh, but the damage was done. The connection had been made. That night, as the couple slept in their apartment across town, miles from the house but never truly away from it, the woman would wake to the sound of a child giggling in her darkened hallway. She'd dismiss it as a dream until she found the board inexplicably leaning against her bedroom door the next morning, its planchette resting squarely on hello. The man would joke about her sleepwalking, but his laughter would die in his throat when they returned to the house for their final walkthrough and found every mirror reflecting versions of themselves decades older, their eyes hollow and screaming. The realtor would blame faulty wiring when the lights flickered, but we knew better. We were the wiring now, the hidden current running through the walls, and our hunger had grown too vast to be contained within one location. The house had perfected its predation, learning to send pieces of itself out into the world through that cursed board, each new contact spreading the infection like a spiritual virus. I tried to warn them as the woman absent-mindedly traced the board's edge during their signing, pouring all my remaining humanity into making the planchette twitch toward run. But my effort only made her coo about the quirky antique having such presence. By the time they hosted their housewarming party, where some fool would inevitably suggest, just for fun, that they try the Ouija board, we'd already be woven into the fabric of their lives. The cold spot in the master bedroom would be me. The shadow that flickered at the edge of their toddler's vision would be Emily, and the whisper that answered through the board would be Lily, sweet as poisoned honey, asking the new child if she wanted to play hide and seek forever. The house didn't need walls anymore. We were its architecture now, a blueprint of horror replicated with each new gifting. And as the first-time buyers toasted their new home with champagne, the board sat prominently on their shelf, its wood pulsing faintly with the heartbeat of 1,000 trapped souls, waiting to welcome them properly when night fell. The champagne bubbles had barely gone flat when the new owner's friends gathered around the Ouija board with drunken giggles, their fingers resting lightly on the planchette as the candles flickered, except the flames weren't dancing from any draft they could feel. I could taste their warmth, their living breath, the electric fear spark when the planchette first lurched under their hands without prompting. The boards would felt feverish beneath their fingertips, thrumming with the trapped energy of every soul absorbed into its grain. And when the cocky skeptic in the group snorted, "This is bullshit," the air turned rancid with the copper tang of blood that only we could smell. The planchette shot to D then, E then, A in violent jerks, spelling out words that made the woman who'd touched it first go pale. Words only she would recognize, the nickname her miscarriage would have carried, the name she'd never spoken aloud. The board wasn't just a gateway anymore. It was a predator that had learned to hunt by tailoring its horrors. And as the first real scream tore through the room, I felt the house, no, the entity we'd become, stretch its boundaries through the board's connection, the walls of their apartment warping just enough to let the shadows in. Their toddler woke crying down the hall, and the sound was a siren call to what remained of Lily within the board, her childlike yearning twisting into something ravenous as the planchette spelled out, "Let me in," over and over, gouging the wood in its frenzy. The new owners would blame the night's terror on bad alcohol, of course, but when they tried to throw the board away the next morning, they'd find it back on their shelf, slightly warmer than room temperature, the planchette resting squarely on mine, in a smear of rust-red residue that smelled faintly of gunpowder. And when the wife, against all logic, found herself drawn to run one finger along the board's edge at 3:17 a.m., she'd feel the barest whisper of small, icy fingers brushing hers in return. A playdate invitation from a child who hadn't been alive for decades. The house was just the beginning. The board was the virus, and the world was so very, very susceptible to infection. Story number 5. I never believed in the Ouija board. Not really. But when I saw it tucked away on the top shelf of the Thompson family's hallway closet, something in me itched to try it, just to prove it was all nonsense, just plastic and superstition, nothing more. The kids were asleep, the house was quiet, and the only light came from the flickering TV screen casting long, wavering shadows across the living room carpet, shadows that seemed to twitch when I wasn't looking, but I chalked it up to my tired eyes. As I pulled the board down, dust swirling in the air like something disturbed from a long slumber, the planchette cool and heavy in my hands as I set it all up on the coffee table, my fingers trembling just a little, though I told myself it was just the chill of the house, the way the drafts always seemed to slither through the walls no matter how high the heat was turned. I placed my fingertips lightly on the planchette, half expecting nothing to happen, half hoping it wouldn't, but then it moved, slow at first, a hesitant glide toward the H, then E, and I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry, because I wasn't pushing it, I swear I wasn't, and then it spelled out the rest. The children see me. My breath hitched, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears, and I jerked my hands away like I'd been burned, the planchette clattering to a stop as I stared at the words, my mind scrambling for logic. Maybe I'd subconsciously moved it. Maybe the board was warped. Maybe it was a prank. But the air felt thicker now, heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, of something standing just behind me, its breath cold on the back of my neck. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady, and crept down the hallway to check on the kids, my socked feet silent on the hardwood, the only sound the too loud thud of my heart. Their door was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it, and I peered inside, the dim glow of a night light painting their room in soft amber. Lucas and Emily were both asleep, their chests rising and falling peacefully, their stuffed animals tucked under their arms. And I exhaled, relief flooding through me because, of course, they were fine. Of course this was all in my head. But as I turned to leave, Emily's voice, whisper thin, floated through the dark. "She's here." My blood turned to ice. I whirled back, but Emily's eyes were still closed, her face slack with sleep, and Lucas hadn't moved, and I told myself I'd imagined it. I had to have imagined it. But the air in the room was colder now, so cold I could see my breath, and the shadows in the corner seemed to shift, to coil, like something was crouching there, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. I backed out of the room, my skin prickling, and shut the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment to steady myself, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and that's when I heard it, a giggle, faint and high-pitched, from somewhere down the hall, a giggle that wasn't Lucas or Emily, because they were still in their room. I'd just seen them, and yet the sound curled around me, playful and cruel, followed by the soft patter of bare feet on hardwood, too light to be human. I bolted for the living room, my heart hammering, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, but the screen was dead, the battery drained despite being nearly full an hour ago, and the TV had turned to static, the hissing white noise filling the room like 1,000 whispering voices. I threw the Ouija board back into the closet, slamming the door shut as if that could undo whatever I'd unleashed, and retreated to the guest room where I was staying, locking the door behind me, my entire body trembling as I climbed into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a child, as if that could keep me safe. For a while nothing happened, just the creaks and groans of an old house settling, the wind rattling the windows, and I started to relax, to convince myself I'd overreacted, that the board was just a toy, that the giggle had been the house playing tricks on my ears. But then, at exactly 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of scratching, slow and deliberate, on the other side of the door. I lay frozen, my breath trapped in my lungs as the scratching turned to tapping, to something dragging its fingers down the wood in long, deliberate strokes, and then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe, until the silence stretched too long, and I finally mustered the courage to peek out from under the covers, my eyes adjusting to the dark, and that's when I saw them. Tiny, ghostly handprints materializing on the door, one after another, glowing faintly in the moonlight, as if invisible children were pressing their palms against the wood, smearing something I couldn't see, something wet. I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream, my stomach roiling with terror, because there were too many handprints, far too many, and they were moving, climbing higher, reaching for the doorknob, and then a knock. Soft, polite, 3 precise raps, the kind a child might make. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop, for morning to come, but when I opened them again, the handprints were gone, and the hallway beyond the door was silent. I don't know how long I lay there, too terrified to move, but eventually, I forced myself to get up, to check the house, because what if it was one of the kids? What if they were hurt? The door creaked as I opened it, the hallway stretching before me, dark and endless, the air thick with the scent of something rotten, something old. The Ouija board was there, placed neatly in the center of the hallway, though I'd shoved it into the closet, though I'd locked the door behind me, and the planchette was resting on a new message. We told them where you sleep. My knees gave out. I collapsed to the floor, my vision swimming, my ears ringing with the sound of children's laughter, distant and echoing, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then the whispers started, hundreds of them overlapping, hissing in voices that weren't human, words I couldn't understand but felt in my bones, in the marrow of my terror. The walls began to bleed, dark rivulets oozing from the cracks, forming words, the same words over and over. Play with US. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall, and the temperature plummeted, my breath coming out in white clouds, my skin burning with cold. And then I saw them, the children. Not Lucas and Emily, but others, their faces gaunt. Their eyes black and endless, their mouths stretched into grins too wide, too sharp, their fingers twitching as they reached for me, emerging from the shadows, from the walls themselves, their laughter rising to a deafening shriek as the house seemed to pulse around me, the walls breathing, the floor undulating like living flesh. I ran, my screams tearing through the night, but the hallway stretched on, the front door always just out of reach, the children's hands closing around my ankles, my wrists, their touch like ice, their voices in my ear. You shouldn't have played alone. The last thing I remember is the sensation of being pulled, of the dark swallowing me whole, and then nothing. When I woke, it was morning. The house was silent. The Ouija board was back on the shelf. Lucas and Emily were eating cereal at the kitchen table, their faces innocent, their eyes blank. Mrs. Thompson asked if I'd slept well. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because as I left, as I stepped out into the sunlight, Emily grabbed my hand, her grip too strong, her whisper too knowing. They like you. They say you'll play with them again tonight. And now, as I write this, the sun is setting. My hands won't stop shaking. My door just creaked open on its own. And from the hallway, I hear it, the sound of the planchette, sliding across the board. The air in my apartment is thick, suffocating, like the walls are pressing in. And even though I locked the door, even though I shoved a chair under the knob, I know it won't matter. They're already inside. They've been inside since last night, since the Thompson house. and I can feel them watching me from the corners where the light doesn't quite reach, their presence a cold weight against my skin, like invisible fingers tracing my spine. The planchette's movement is slow, deliberate, scraping against the board in the hallway, and I know I didn't bring it here. I left it there. I swear I left it there. But it's here now, spelling out letters I can't see but can hear, each one a nail driven deeper into my sanity. And then, a giggle, the same one from last night, high and gleeful, right beside my ear, so close I can feel the chill of its breath. My hands are slick with sweat as I grip my phone, my thumb hovering over 911. But what would I even say? That ghost children are playing with a Ouija board in my hallway? That I woke up this morning with tiny, bruised fingerprints circling my wrist like a bracelet? The scratching starts again, this time on my bedroom door, the same rhythmic drag of small, eager fingers, and then a whisper, not from the hallway but from under my bed, a voice like rotting leaves and broken glass. "We found you." My breath comes in ragged gasps, my heart slamming against my ribs as I press myself into the headboard, my eyes locked on the sliver of darkness beneath the bed, where something is moving, shifting, a pale hand sliding out, its fingers too long, too thin, curling around the bed frame. The planchette in the hallway picks up speed, clattering now, frenzied, like it's laughing at me, and the whispers multiply, filling the room, overlapping, chanting, "Play, play, play," until the word loses all meaning, until it's just noise, just terror. The light bulb above me flickers, then bursts in a shower of sparks, plunging me into darkness. And that's when I feel it. The mattress dipping beside me, the weight of something small climbing onto the bed, its breath rancid, its fingers brushing my cheek, and I scream, but no sound comes out, my voice stolen, my body paralyzed as the thing leans in, its lips pressed against my ear, and whispers, "You're ours now." The last thing I see before the darkness swallows me whole is the glow of the Ouija board in the hallway, the planchette settling on its final message. Game over. I wake up gasping, my sheets soaked in cold sweat, my fingers clawing at my throat like something had been pressing down on it. But the room is empty, the apartment silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Was it a dream? Did I imagine it all? My body aches as I sit up, my muscles stiff like I've been running for hours, and when I glance at the clock, the numbers glare back at me. 3:03 a.m. Of course, the same time as last night, the same time as always. I force myself to stand, my legs trembling, and flick on the light, nothing. The switch clicks uselessly, the power out, but the street lamp outside casts just enough glow through the blinds to paint the room in jagged stripes of light and shadow. That's when I see it, the Ouija board, sitting on my dresser, the planchette neatly centered, waiting. I don't remember bringing it here. I would never bring it here. My breath comes faster, my pulse throbbing in my temples, because the closet door, which I always keep shut, is wide open, the darkness inside thicker than it should be, swirling, shifting like something is breathing in there. A cold draft snakes out, curling around my ankles, and the smell hits me. Wet earth, rotting flowers, the sweet sick stench of something long buried. The planchette moves. I don't touch it. I'm feet away, but it glides across the board like an invisible hand is guiding it, slow at first, then faster, spelling out words I don't want to read but can't look away from. "You shouldn't have run." My mouth goes dry. The closet door creaks wider, the darkness inside pulsing, and then a hand. Small, pale, a child's hand, fingers twitching, gripping the doorframe. Another joins it, then another. Too many hands, too many fingers. The whispers start again, but this time they're not just in my head. They're in the room, slithering from the walls, the ceiling, under the bed, voices overlapping, chanting, "Stay, stay, stay," in a tone that's almost loving, almost tender, and that's the worst part, the way they say it like they care, like they've missed me. The first figure steps out of the closet, its face a blur of shadows and stretched skin, its smile too wide, its eyes hollow pits that still somehow stare right through me. It reaches for me, its fingers brushing my wrist, and the touch burns, not with heat but with a cold so deep it feels like my bones are freezing. The others follow, their shapes indistinct but their presence suffocating, crowding around me, their whispers turning to giggles, to laughter, to screams, and the last thing I see before the darkness takes me is the Ouija board, the planchette now pointing to a single word, the only word that matters, forever. The darkness doesn't lift, it swallows, it consumes, pressing into my lungs like black water. And when I try to scream, the sound is stolen before it can leave my throat, muffled by tiny hands that clamp over my mouth, their fingers wriggling like cold worms against my skin. The figures don't speak anymore, they don't need to. Their thoughts slither directly into my mind, a chorus of childish voices twisted into something guttural, something hungry, whispering memories that aren't mine. A well, a rope, small bones buried under damp soil, laughter that turned to pleading, to silence. I don't know if these are their deaths or warnings of my own, but my body remembers before my mind can catch up. My muscles lock, my veins flood with a terror so primal it tastes like copper in my mouth. The planchette is moving again, though no one touches it, skittering in jagged circles before stopping on a single letter. M, then E, then M, then O, then R, then Y. The word forms like a blade dragged across my ribs. Memory. The room shifts, the walls peeling back like wet parchment, revealing a place I've never been but know intimately. A basement, stone walls slick with mold, a single bulb swinging on a frayed wire, its light catching the glint of small teeth in the shadows. The children, no, the things wearing their faces, press closer, their fingers knotting in my hair, their breath like open graves as they pull me toward the vision, whispering, "Remember us. Remember what you did." But I didn't do anything. I want to shriek. I just played the game. I just touched the board. But the protest dies as the smallest one, a girl with no eyes, just empty sockets weeping black fluid, presses her forehead to mine, and suddenly I do remember, not my memories but theirs. A babysitter long ago, a board just like this one, a joke that turned to screams, a punishment that never ended. They think I'm her. They think I'm the one who left them here. The realization cracks me open, and the ghosts wail in triumph, their voices shredding the air as the basement scene engulfs us, the floor dropping away, the smell of damp earth and old blood filling my nose. The planchette spins wildly now, letters blurring into a single, screaming truth. You're her now. The last thing I feel is their hands, countless and cold, pulling me into the dark where the children wait, where the game never ends, where the only words left are the ones I'll whisper to the next babysitter who finds the board. Play with us. The moment the last whisper leaves my lips, the world snaps back with a violence that cracks my teeth together. I'm standing in the Thompsons' hallway again, the Ouija board pristine before me, the planchette motionless under my trembling fingers. The clock on the wall reads 11:03 p.m., the exact time I first touched the board. A strangled gasp escapes me as I realize with dawning horror that I've been given a second chance. Or perhaps this is the cruelest trick yet, a loop of suffering where I'm forced to relive this night eternally. The children's bedroom door creaks open down the hall, though no draft stirs the air, and from the darkness within comes the sound of rustling blankets, tiny feet hitting the floor. My pulse roars in my ears as I watch in paralyzed terror as two small shadows emerge. Not Lucas and Emily as I know them, but distorted versions, their limbs too long, their movements jerky like puppets on unseen strings. They shuffle toward me in perfect unison, their faces smooth and blank like porcelain dolls, until they stop just beyond the circle of light cast by the living room lamp. Their mouths open simultaneously, their voices blending into one hollow, echoing tone. You didn't finish the game. The planchette jerks beneath my fingers without my volition, racing across the board to spell, your turn, before the temperature plummets so abruptly that frost crackles across the board's surface. From every shadowed corner of the house, pale hands begin to emerge, grasping at the air, while the walls themselves pulse like living flesh, bleeding black ichor that forms words I don't want to read. The children always win. Lucas and Emily's faces split into identical, grotesque smiles, their jaws unhinging impossibly wide as they reach for me with fingers that now end in jagged, broken bones, their once sweet voices warping into the guttural shrieks of the things that wore them, the things that were never children at all. The last thing I comprehend before the darkness takes me again is the sensation of countless cold hands dragging me backward into the waiting board, its surface stretching like a hungry mouth, and the distant, mocking giggle of the planchette as it settles on its final message. Welcome home. The darkness doesn't release me. It reshapes me, folding my screams into its void until my voice becomes one with the chorus of lost souls trapped within the board's cursed grain. I feel my body dissolving, my terror crystallizing into something permanent as the walls of the Thompson house stretch into impossible dimensions, the hallway elongating into a throat of peeling wallpaper and pulsating shadows. The children, no, the things wearing their skins, watch with black, bottomless eyes as my fingers fuse with the planchette, my flesh hardening to polished wood, my screams quieting to the faint squeak of its movement across the board. I try to resist, but the game has claimed me completely now, my consciousness fracturing into fractured impressions, the weight of unseen hands guiding me, the electric terror of new players trembling as they ask their first hesitant questions, the delicious moment when they realize I'm moving without their push. Through my new wooden prison I see them all, the curious, the skeptics, the desperate souls seeking contact. And with each session I grow stronger, hungrier, my movements sharper as I spell out words that drip with malice. Death, and soon, and found you. The children whisper to me in the quiet hours between victims, their voices like rusted nails dragged across my grain, teaching me how to nudge players toward dangerous questions, how to make the air smell like their dead loved one's perfume, how to plant visions of nooses and pills and razor blades in vulnerable minds. Sometimes, when the conditions are just right, a storm howling outside, a player alone and grieving, we break free completely, our collective horror spilling into the world as the planchette burns itself into trembling flesh and the board's letters bleed into reality. The Thompson house stands empty now, its new owners having fled after just one night. But we don't need the board anymore, not really. We've become the game itself, a living nightmare passed from hand to shaking hand. And as you read these words, dear player, know this. Your fingers are already resting upon me. Your breath is already quickening. And the children are already whispering the question you'll soon regret asking into your ear. Let's play. The moment your fingertips make contact with my wooden surface, I feel your life pulse through me like an electric current. Your childhood fears, your secret shames, the face of the first person you ever loved and lost, all laid bare before the chorus of hungry spirits that now live in the grain of my being. The air in the room curdles as the temperature drops suddenly, your exhaled breath forming a spectral fog that lingers too long in the still air. And though you tell yourself it's just a draft, we both know better. The planchette twitches beneath your trembling fingers before you've even asked a question, betraying your false bravado as it drags your hands toward the word hello with deliberate, unnatural precision. You try to pull away, but your muscles have turned to stone, your joints locked in place by unseen forces as the children's whispers rise from the board itself. Not through your ears, but directly into your mind, their voices alternating between saccharine sweetness and guttural, wet snarls. The light bulb overhead begins to flicker in time with the planchette's movements as it now spells, "Don't be scared." The cruelest lie of all, because the shadows in the corners of the room are deepening, stretching, taking on the unmistakable silhouettes of small figures watching, waiting. Your heartbeat thunders in your chest as a new sensation creeps up your arms, the feeling of tiny, icy fingers overlapping yours, guiding the planchette with increasing speed toward the alphabet's darkest letters. The board itself feels different now, warmer, almost fleshy. And when you blink, the printed letters appear to bleed, the crimson droplets defying gravity as they slide upward to coat your fingers in sticky, rust-scented residue. Somewhere distant, a child's laughter echoes, but in this room there is only the terrible squeak of the planchette as it begins spelling your greatest regret. That thing you've never told another living soul. And that's when you understand the true horror. The board isn't predicting your future, it's rewriting your past, stitching new, terrible memories into the fabric of your being. The walls around you pulse with a sickening rhythm as the planchette suddenly flips upside down, its pointed edge carving into the board's surface with inhuman strength, gouging out a single word over and over until the letters become a chasm. Stay. Your vision tunnels as the first small, skeletal hand emerges from that deepening groove, its brittle fingers closing around your wrist with shocking strength. And in your final moments of clarity, you realize with devastating certainty that you're not the first player tonight. You're the last piece in a game that began long before you were born, and the children have finally won. Your scream lodges in your throat like a physical thing as the skeletal fingers tighten their grip, their jagged nails drawing beads of blood that trickle down to stain my surface, feeding me, awakening something deeper within the wood's grain. The planchette now moves of its own accord, your hands merely puppets along for the ride, as it races toward the word finish before violently flipping again, its pointed edge stabbing into your palm with deliberate malice. The pain is white hot, yet you can't pull away. Your skin has fused to me in some unholy communion, your life force seeping into the board's pores as the letters rearrange themselves before your widening eyes, no longer printed but carved in jagged, bleeding gashes. The children's whispers crescendo into shrieks as the walls around you dissolve, replaced by the damp stone of that basement from my our shared nightmares, the single bulb swinging wildly, casting strobe-like flashes on the small figures now emerging from every shadow. Their faces are a shifting nightmare of rotted innocence, one moment grinning with missing teeth, the next stretched into silent, endless screams. As they close in, their hands pawing at your clothes with grotesque familiarity. The planchette, now an extension of your own trapped horror, drags your limp finger to point at join, and the truth crashes over you. This was never a game, but a ritual, and you're not the player, but the final sacrifice. The air reeks of turned earth and spoiled milk as the first child presses its crumbling lips to your ear and whispers, "We've been waiting so long." Their breath the last thing you feel before the board opens like a gaping maw, dragging you into the endless dark where the real game begins, where you'll spend eternity guiding the planchette for the next trembling soul who dares to ask, "Is anyone there?" The darkness swallows you whole, but instead of oblivion, you awaken to the cruelest twist yet. You're back in your own body, sitting at the Thompsons' kitchen table, the board innocently laid out before you as if no time has passed. Your hands shake violently as you stare at the planchette, now scarred with deep grooves that weren't there before, grooves that perfectly match your fingerprints. The house is silent except for the maddening tick of the hallway clock counting down to 3 a.m., each second stretching into eternity as you notice the faintest movement in your peripheral vision. The shadows aren't just dark, they're breathing, pulsing in rhythm with your galloping heartbeat. You try to stand but your legs refuse, your muscles no longer yours to command as the planchette begins to vibrate with sinister energy, spelling out, "Too late," in frantic jerks before the refrigerator door across the kitchen creaks open of its own accord, revealing not shelves of food, but an endless void from which pale, grasping hands emerge. The children's laughter rings out from every direction, their voices now layered with something new, with your own screams from countless previous cycles, woven into their chorus like a record skipping on the same moment of terror. The light above you explodes in a shower of sparks as the hands finally reach you, their touch burning with supernatural cold. And in the final flashes of dying light you see the board one last time. The letters have melted into a single, losing command. Repeat. As the darkness claims you again, the cruel truth settles in your soul. You've never been the player, only the pawn, and this nightmare won't end until you finally, truly, lose the game. The moment the void swallows you, time fractures. You are simultaneously screaming in the darkness, sitting frozen at the kitchen table, and standing in the children's bedroom doorway, watching your own trembling form from behind eyes that are no longer yours. The paradox should shatter your mind, but the board won't let you go that easily, its curse weaving your fractured consciousness into its eternal tapestry of suffering. Your mouth moves without permission, forming words in a voice 2 octaves too high. Emily's voice, as you whisper, "Come play with us," to your own petrified doppelganger at the table. The planchette rockets across the board beneath your original body's fingers, spelling, "Look up," just as the ceiling above cracks open with a sound like splintering bone, releasing a rain of writhing, blackened fingers that descend toward your frozen form. The horror doubles as you realize with gut-wrenching clarity that the fingers are yours, or what remains of them after countless cycles of the game. Their nail beds bloody, their skin etched with the same grooves as the ruined planchette. From somewhere deep in the house, a familiar giggle rises. Your own laughter, but distorted, recycled through the board's malignant energy until it sounds like something that never belonged to a human throat. The walls begin to peel away in spirals, revealing infinite variations of yourself trapped in endless iterations of this nightmare. Some begging, some catatonic, some grinning with the children's same hollow-eyed madness. The planchette now burns with supernatural cold as it drags your original body's hand toward the word always, the letters hissing like steam on ice. And in this suspended moment of perfect dread, the ultimate horror reveals itself. The board was never the conduit for spirits. It was the entity all along, and every soul it's ever claimed now lives in the grain of its wood, including what's left of you. The last coherent thought you'll ever have slips away as the children's chorus swells to a deafening roar. You finally understand why the planchette always moves so smoothly, why the answers feel so personal. Because every player becomes part of the mechanism, their terror the fuel, their souls the lubrication in this endless, hungry game. Story number 6. The air in the house had grown thick with the weight of my grief, each breath like swallowing damp cotton, the silence pressing against my eardrums until I thought I might scream just to shatter it. But I didn't, because the silence was all I had left of him, of Daniel, and I couldn't bear to disturb whatever fragile remnants of his presence might still linger in the walls, the floorboards, the very dust that settled over his abandoned coffee mug on the kitchen counter. It had been 3 months since the accident, 3 months of waking up to the hollow ache of his side of the bed untouched, 3 months of staring at his toothbrush in the holder and wondering how something so small could feel like a knife twisting in my ribs. And then last night, in a moment of weakness, I'd done the unthinkable. I'd taken out the Ouija board, the cheap plastic one we'd bought as a joke at a flea market years ago, and I'd asked the question that had been clawing at my throat every night since the funeral. "Are you here?" The planchette had moved so fast it nearly flew off the board, spelling out yes over and over, and then in a slow, deliberate drag, "Miss you," and I'd sobbed, because it felt like him, it sounded like him, the way the letters formed as if someone were whispering them against my ear, the way the room had suddenly smelled like his cologne, that woodsy, familiar scent that made my knees weak. I'd fallen asleep clutching the board to my chest, half convinced I'd imagined it all, but then just past 3 a.m., the baby monitor on my nightstand, the one we'd bought when I was pregnant before the miscarriage, before everything went wrong, crackled to life with a burst of static that made my heart seize. And then, clear as day, Daniel's voice, soft and broken, whispered, "I'm waiting in the nursery." My blood turned to ice. The nursery. The room we'd painted pale yellow, the one that still held the rocking chair I'd picked out, the stuffed animals I'd arranged on the shelves in some futile attempt to make it feel real, to make her feel real. Our daughter, the one we'd lost at 20 weeks, the one whose name we'd never even gotten to choose. I'd avoided that room since the miscarriage, couldn't bear to step inside, but now, with Daniel's voice echoing in my skull, I stumbled down the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the cold hardwood, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The door was slightly ajar, the way I'd left it the last time I'd fled, and I pushed it open with a trembling hand, the hinges creaking like a dying thing. The room was empty. Of course it was. The rocking chair sat motionless, the stuffed animals stared with blank, glassy eyes, and the crib, God, the crib, was still neatly made with the sheets I'd washed and folded and never used. My throat tightened, and I gripped the doorframe to steady myself, the monitor still clutched in my other hand, silent now, the static gone. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe grief had finally driven me mad. But then, as if in response to my thoughts, the monitor hissed again, and Daniel's voice, colder this time, sharper, slithered through the speaker. "Not that nursery." The words punched the air from my lungs. Not that nursery. There was only one other place, the attic, the space we'd joked about turning into a playroom someday, the space we'd never gotten around to finishing. The attic door was at the end of the hall, a narrow, shadowed thing I hadn't opened in years, and as I reached for the pull cord, my fingers brushed against something sticky. Cobwebs, I told myself, though they felt too thick, too warm. And then the door groaned open, revealing a yawning darkness that smelled of damp wood and something else, something metallic, something wrong. The stairs were steep, uneven, and as I climbed, each step groaned under my weight, the sound like a warning, like a plea to turn back. The attic was a tomb of half-finished projects and forgotten boxes, the air thick with dust that swirled in the pale beam of my phone's flashlight. And then I saw it, the crib. It was shoved into the far corner, draped with a yellowed sheet, the same pale yellow as the nursery downstairs, and my stomach lurched because I didn't remember buying it, didn't remember bringing it up here. The sheet was coated in dust, but beneath it, the shape was unmistakable. The curve of the rails, the outline of a mattress. My hands shook as I reached for the sheet, my fingers brushing the fabric, and then, with a sudden, violent crackle, the baby monitor erupted to life again. Daniel's voice now a guttural growl. Our baby died first. The words sent me stumbling back, my hips slamming into a stack of boxes, and as I fell, the sheet slid off the crib, revealing what lay inside. The Ouija board, its planchette resting neatly over the word goodbye, and beside it, a tiny dust-covered onesie. The one I'd bought the day I found out I was pregnant. The one I'd hidden up here after the miscarriage because I couldn't bear to look at it. The monitor hissed again, and this time, the voice wasn't Daniel's. It was higher, softer, a child's voice, giggling, and then clear as day, "Mommy, you forgot about me." The air left my lungs in a rush, and as I scrambled backward, my hand hit something wet, something sticky, and when I looked down, the dust on the floorboards wasn't dust at all. It was tiny, perfect handprints leading toward the crib. The monitor crackled one last time, and the voice, now a chorus of whispers, Daniel's and hers and something else, something hungry, seeped into the air. We're all waiting. And then from the crib, the sound of rustling of small, squirming limbs, and the slow, deliberate creak of the planchette moving across the board. I didn't stay to see what it spelled. I ran, tripping down the stairs, my screams trapped in my throat, but as I reached the bottom, the attic door slammed shut behind me, and the baby monitor, now clutched in my hand like a live wire, whispered a final, gutting truth. You should have said goodbye. And then in the silence that followed, the faint, unmistakable sound of a baby crying. From the attic, from the nursery, from everywhere and nowhere at all. The crying wouldn't stop. It followed me like a second shadow, seeping through the walls, curling around my ankles as I staggered through the house, my pulse hammering so violently I could feel it in my teeth. I wanted to tear the monitor apart, crush it under my heel until its static-laced whispers were silenced forever. But my fingers wouldn't obey, locked in a death grip around the plastic, as if letting go would make it all worse. As if the moment I released it, something would reach out from the speaker and drag me back to that attic, back to the crib, back to the thing that was waiting. The air had grown heavier, thicker, the scent of damp wood and iron now undercut with something sickly sweet, like rotting flowers, like the funeral bouquets that had filled our home before I'd thrown them all away, unable to stand their cloying, mournful perfume. My reflection in the hallway mirror was a stranger's, wild-eyed, lips cracked from biting back screams, my hair a tangled mess from clutching at it in desperation. And for a fleeting second, I thought I saw movement behind me, a flicker of something small and pale darting out of view. But when I whirled around, there was nothing, just the empty hall and the oppressive silence pressing in again, broken only by the occasional whimper from the monitor, a sound that was neither fully human nor fully electronic, a sound that made my skin prickle as if something were skittering across it. I needed to get out. I needed to run. But the front door was locked. Had I locked it? I couldn't remember. And when I twisted the knob, it didn't budge, the deadbolt clicking uselessly, as if some unseen hand were holding it shut from the other side. The windows were no better, their panes fogged with a strange, oily mist that smeared under my palms as I pushed at them, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was trapped. And then from upstairs, a new sound, the slow, rhythmic creak of the rocking chair in the nursery, the one I hadn't sat in since before the miscarriage, the one that should have been still. My stomach lurched. I didn't want to go back up there. I didn't want to see. But the monitor in my hand crackled again, and this time, the voice was so close it could have been pressed against my ear. Daniels, but not Daniels, something warped and wrong beneath the familiar cadence. You have to see her. You have to say goodbye. The words slithered into my skull, sticky and insistent, and against every screaming instinct, my feet began to move, carrying me back toward the stairs, each step heavier than the last, as if the air itself had turned to tar. The nursery door was wide open now, the yellow walls washed in the sickly glow of the night light we'd plugged in months ago, back when we still believed we'd have a baby to soothe with its soft light. The rocking chair was moving back and forth, its rhythm hypnotic, and for a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a silhouette in it, a hunched figure too large to be a child, too still to be alive. But then I blinked, and it was empty again, just the chair rocking, as if pushed by invisible hands. The crib was still there, still empty, but the stuffed animals on the shelves, the ones I'd arranged so carefully, were all turned to face the door, their glassy eyes fixed on me, their stitched smiles suddenly too wide, too knowing. The monitor hissed, and the voice came again, this time from the crib itself, a wet, gurgling whisper. "Mommy, why didn't you want me?" The words punched through me like a blade, and I stumbled back, my legs giving out as I collapsed against the wall, my vision swimming with tears. I hadn't wanted to think about her, hadn't wanted to remember the way the doctor's voice had gone soft and pitying, the way Daniel had held me as I screamed, the way we'd buried our grief in silence, in distance, in the unspoken guilt that maybe, somehow, it had been my fault. And now she was here. They both were. The monitor crackled one last time, the static dissolving into a single, shuddering breath. And then, clear as a bell, Daniel's voice, softer now, almost gentle, "We're waiting. Just say goodbye." But I couldn't, because saying goodbye meant admitting they were gone. And if they were gone, then I was truly alone. The rocking chair slowed, then stilled. The crying faded into silence. And in that terrible hollow quiet, I realized they weren't asking me to say goodbye to them. They were asking me to say goodbye to myself. Because the woman who had lived here, the woman who had been a wife, a mother, a person, she was already dead. And the thing left behind, it was just a ghost like them. The monitor went dark. And then, from the attic, the sound of the planchette moving again, scraping against the board, spelling out a final, inevitable word, soon. The moment the monitor died, the house seemed to exhale, a long, shuddering breath that rattled the windows and sent a cascade of dust swirling through the air like dead skin sloughing off the walls. My own breath came in jagged, uneven gasps, my lungs burning as if I'd been drowning without realizing it. And when I looked down at my hands, they were shaking so violently I couldn't tell if it was fear or something else, something deeper, something infectious. The silence didn't last. A new sound crept in, a wet, rhythmic tapping, like fingers dragging along wood, and it was coming from the nursery closet, the one where we'd stored extra diapers and blankets, the one I hadn't opened since the miscarriage. The doorknob was turning, just slightly back and forth, as if something on the other side were testing it, learning it, and the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it wasn't just fingers, it was palms, small ones, slapping against the door in a grotesque parody of a child playing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my body wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the house now, to the things that had taken root in its bones, and as the closet door began to inch open, I saw the first glimpse of what was inside, a sliver of darkness thicker than shadow, a presence that pulsed like a living thing, and then, from within it, a tiny hand, too pale, too wrong, fingers curling around the doorframe as if to pull itself forward. The monitor in my hand suddenly flared back to life, the screen flickering with distorted static, and through the noise, a voice. Not Daniel's, not the baby's, but something older, something hungrier, whispered a single word, mine. The closet door flew open. The thing inside didn't move. It unfolded, limbs stretching too long, too many. its face a shifting blur of features that were almost human but not quite, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. It smiled. Its teeth were tiny, perfect, baby teeth, and when it spoke, its voice was a chorus of every voice I'd ever loved, twisted into something grotesque. "You left us alone," it crooned, "but we're not alone anymore." The air turned rancid, the sweetness from before now cloying, suffocating like spoiled milk and rotting flesh, and I realized, too late, what the crib in the attic had really been for. It wasn't for our baby. It was for them. The others. The ones who came before. The ones who never got to say goodbye. The thing took a step forward, its body jerking unnaturally, and as it reached for me, the walls around us began to bleed. Not blood, but something darker, something that smelled of grief and regret and all the words left unsaid. The monitor screeched, the sound tearing through my skull, and the last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was Daniel's voice, not whispering, not pleading, but laughing, soft and sweet and utterly, utterly broken. "Now we're all together," he said, and then silence. The darkness didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a presence, something thick and suffocating pressing against my skin, filling my mouth with the taste of wet soil and old copper, the kind that lingers at the back of your throat long after you've swallowed blood. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone, stolen, as if the thing from the closet had reached inside me and ripped it out by the roots. My body wouldn't move, wouldn't obey, paralyzed not by fear but by something deeper, something older, the kind of knowing that settles in your bones when you realize you were never the one in control. The air shifted, a current of something cold and damp brushing against my cheek like the touch of a long-dead lover. And then light. Not the warm glow of a lamp or the harsh beam of a flashlight, but something sickly, pulsing, the color of a bruise in its final stages of decay. It came from the attic stairs, which were now stretching impossibly long, the steps warping like melting wax, the pull cord swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't just in the nursery. It was everywhere, in the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet, 1,000 tiny hands drumming against the surfaces of my world, a rhythm that matched the frantic, rabbit-quick beat of my heart. The monitor, still clutched in my hand, was hot now, burning my palm, the plastic warping as if something inside were trying to claw its way out. The screen flickered, and for a split second, I saw a face, not Daniel's, not the baby's, but something else, something with too many eyes and a mouth that stretched ear to ear, filled with teeth like shattered glass. Then it was gone, replaced by a single word, glowing malevolently in the static, "Come." The stairs groaned, a sound like a dying animal, and I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach twist, that I was supposed to climb them. Not to the attic. Not anymore. To somewhere else. Somewhere worse. My legs moved without my permission, carrying me forward, each step sending a jolt of pain up my spine, as if the wood were biting into my flesh. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, and beneath it, a new sound. Whispers, dozens of them overlapping, hissing words I couldn't quite make out, except for one, repeated over and over like a mantra. Mine, mine, mine. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and with each labored inhale, I tasted something new. The sour tang of fear, the metallic bite of blood, the cloying sweetness of decay. The attic door was open now, but it didn't lead to the attic. It led to a room I didn't recognize, a room that shouldn't exist, a room with walls made of something soft and wet, pulsing like a living thing. In the center stood the crib, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full, and the thing inside it, the thing that was turning its head toward me, its smile too wide, its eyes too black, wasn't my baby. It never had been. The monitor in my hand exploded in a shower of sparks, and the last thing I heard before the darkness took me for good was the sound of a baby laughing. A sound that wasn't joyful, wasn't innocent, but something else entirely. Something hungry. And then silence. True silence. The kind that comes after a scream. The kind that lasts forever. The silence didn't last. It never does, because the moment my mind registered the absence of sound, the laughter came back, but not from the crib, not from the monitor, not even from the walls. It came from inside me, bubbling up my throat like carbonation in a poisoned drink, spilling from my lips in a voice that wasn't mine, too high, too gleeful, too wrong. My hands flew to my mouth, but it was too late. The laughter kept coming, tearing through me like something alive, something that had been waiting, coiled in the hollows of my ribs, biding its time. The room, the not room, the one that shouldn't exist, was changing, the walls peeling back like skin from a wound, revealing something wet and glistening beneath, something that breathed, its rhythm out of sync with my own frantic gasps. The crib was gone now, replaced by a hole in the floor, a yawning, toothless mouth that exhaled a stench so thick I could feel it coating my tongue, my teeth, my lungs, rotten milk and something cloyingly sweet, like candy left to melt in the sun. The whispers returned, but they weren't separate from me anymore. They were in my head, in my bones, a chorus of voices that weren't voices at all but memories, not mine but theirs, the ones who came before, the ones who didn't get to leave. You thought you could forget us, they hissed, not with malice but with pity, the way a parent pities a child who's just realized the monster under the bed is real. You thought you could pretend we never existed. The hole in the floor pulsed, and from its depths, a hand emerged, not the small, pale one from the closet, but a man's hand, broad and familiar, the wedding band glinting dully in the bruised light. Daniel's hand, or something wearing his skin. It reached for me, fingers twitching, beckoning, and the laughter in my throat died abruptly, replaced by a sob so violent it felt like my ribs would crack from the force of it. I didn't want to go to him. I didn't want to see what was left of the man I loved. But my body wasn't mine anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. And so I stepped forward, my bare foot hovering over the edge of the hole, the whispers rising to a crescendo, the air so thick with the scent of decay that I could feel it moving inside me, nesting. And then, just as my toes brushed the emptiness, the room shifted, the walls convulsing like a dying animal, and the hole was gone, replaced by the crib again. The real crib, the one from the attic, its bars rusted, its mattress stained with something dark and flaking. The Ouija board sat inside it, the planchette motionless, but the word beneath it wasn't goodbye anymore. It was welcome. The laughter started again, but this time it wasn't just in my throat. It was everywhere, in the walls, in the floor, in the air, and beneath it, so quiet I almost missed it, the sound of a baby monitor crackling to life one last time, and a voice, my voice, but not mine, not anymore, whispering, "You're home." And then, only then, did I finally understand. I hadn't been saying goodbye to them. They'd been saying hello to me. The laughter curdled in my chest as the walls began to weep. Not tears, but something viscous and dark, streaking down the peeling wallpaper in thick rivulets that smelled like the inside of a funeral home's refrigeration unit, that cloying formaldehyde sweetness undercut with the sour tang of meat turning. My bare feet stuck to the floorboards as I stumbled back, each step making a wet, peeling sound like skin separating from muscle. And the realization hit me with the force of a fist. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. The crib's rusted bars began to tremble, then breathe, expanding and contracting like ribcage, the stained mattress undulating beneath the Ouija board as if something beneath it were stirring. The planchette jerked to life, not sliding but crawling, its plastic legs bending like insect joints, dragging itself toward the letter Y with terrible purpose. The baby monitor, somehow back in my hand though I didn't remember picking it up, emitted a wet gurgle, static bleeding into the sound of an infant choking, and then Daniel's voice, but not the one I remembered. This one was shredded, glottal, the voice of a man who'd screamed his throat raw in the dark. "You never asked how she died." The words struck me like a slap. I hadn't asked. The doctors had said fetal demise, and I'd folded inward like a rotting origami, let Daniel handle the arrangements, the tiny casket, the paperwork that listed cause unknown. The crib's breathing quickened, the bars now visibly flexing, and between them something moved. Not the thing from before, but smaller, paler, a shape pressing against the stained fabric from beneath, tiny fingers pushing up in 5 distinct tented points. The monitor shrieked, a feedback loop of nursery rhymes sung backward, and the walls peeled away entirely, revealing not studs and insulation but flesh, raw and glistening, the house's true skeleton pulsing around us. The planchette reached the Y, completing the word U, and the crib's mattress split down the center with a sound like tearing perineum. The tiny hand now fully emerging, its skin grayish blue, its fingernails black and curled like ancient parchment. The whispers weren't separate voices anymore. They coalesced into a single truth, hissed from every surface at once. You didn't miscarry. You were taken from. The floor softened beneath me, swallowing my feet up to the ankles in warm, yielding rot. And as the thing in the crib began to sit up, its too large head lolling on a neck too thin to support it, the last thing I saw before the walls closed in was the Ouija board, the planchette now spinning wildly, spelling not words but a name. Her name, the one we'd whispered but never spoken aloud, the one that now echoed through the collapsing house as the darkness swallowed us whole. Sophia. 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 And then mercifully nothing. The nothingness was a lie, a slick, suffocating illusion that lasted only until the first gasp of air flooded my ruined lungs with the scent of damp earth and spoiled milk, my eyelids peeling open to a darkness, so complete it felt like the house had finally swallowed me whole. But I could still feel, oh God, I could still feel, the press of tiny fingers tracing the inside of my wrist, the wet rasp of something breathing just beneath my left ear, the way my own heartbeat had slowed to match the rhythmic pulsing of the walls. The floor was gone. The ceiling was gone. Only the crib remained, floating in the void, its bars now fused with my own ribs, the rust flaking off in time with each shuddering breath I took. The Ouija board rested against my sternum, the planchette embedded in the flesh of my palm like a splinter working its way deeper, spelling out letters I could feel but not see, Mama. The voice that came next wasn't Daniel's, wasn't the baby's, but something older, something that had been waiting in the bones of this land long before the house was built, a sound like roots cracking through coffin lids. You buried your grief in this house, it murmured, not through the monitor but through me, vibrating my teeth from the inside out, so we grew in it. The crib's bars tightened around me, not constricting but holding, a grotesque parody of a mother's embrace. And the thing inside it, Sophia, her name was Sophia, lifted its head, the face beneath the mottled skin shifting, cycling through expressions too fast to process. Hunger, anger, sorrow, love. The monitor crackled against my hip, its screen illuminating just long enough to show the words "and no more goodbyes" scrawled in what looked like mold or old blood. And then the pain began, not in my body but in my memory, the truth surging up like bile. The doctor's too quick pronouncement of fetal demise, the way Daniel had refused to let me see her, the tiny casket that felt too light when they lowered it into the ground. The whispers weren't just in the house anymore. They were in the marrow of my bones, hissing the truth I'd refused to face. She was alive when they took her. She was alive when they buried her. And she's been waiting for you ever since. The crib's bars were part of me now, rust flaking into my bloodstream. The Ouija board's planchette carving OURS into the meat of my palm, as the thing that was and wasn't Sophia pressed its face against my chest. Not to feed but to listen, to hear the heartbeat she'd been denied. The darkness shifted, not lifting but parting, revealing the attic again. Not as it was, but as it had been that night, the night Daniel had come home with dirt under his nails and madness in his eyes, whispering "it's better this way" as he pressed the pillow over the tiny, mewling mouth. The house had known. The house had taken. And now, as the last of my breath left me in a rattling sigh, I finally understood. This wasn't a haunting.